story of Dutch and Hosea does not begin with a gunfight or a hanging tree. It begins with a joke the world never heard, played out on a lonely road in the 1870s, when the old ways were dying and two ambitious outlaws thought they were the cleverest men alive. A coach rolls through the dusk, lanterns swaying, passengers drowsy and unaware. In the brush on one side of the trail, Hosea Matthews waits, patient and amused, already 3 steps ahead in his mind. On the opposite side, Dutch van der Linde crouches with theatrical focus, rehearsing the speech he will deliver when he steps out, revolver in hand, as the living embodiment of frontier rebellion. Each man believes he is about to outsmart some wealthy fool. Each man is, in truth, hunting the other. The punchline comes fast. Hosea moves first, stepping into the road with that wry half-smile, only to freeze as Dutch strides out from the other side at the exact same moment. 2 bandits, 2 guns, one very confused driver. For a heartbeat, it is pure tension. 2 predators realizing the prey is not the coach at all, but the stranger mirroring his every move. Then, against every expectation in a world ruled by paranoia and quick tempers, they start to laugh. Here, from its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is born not from blood, but from shared amusement and instant recognition. Dutch, charismatic and philosophical even then, turns the moment into a speech about fate, about freedom, about how civilization grinds men down until only the bold dare to take back what is owed. Hosea listens, eyes sharp, already measuring the gap between Dutch's words and the world as it really is. He answers with dry remarks, with practical questions, with a quiet warmth that disarms more than any pistol could. Instead of trading bullets, they trade stories. Instead of leaving a body in the dust, they share a bottle in a nearby town. 2 strangers turning into partners over stolen drinks and grand designs. Dutch talks about a roaming family of outlaws, living outside corrupt institutions, striking at railroads and banks that profit from others' misery. Hosea talks about angles and exits, about survival, about how dreams need planning or they become delusions. Together, they sketch a philosophy that feels, in the truest sense, bigger than either man alone. But that first night around a lamplit table also carries the shadow of future betrayal. The same charm that lets Dutch turn a botched robbery into a lifelong bond will one day turn loyalty into a weapon. The same idealistic speeches that inspire Hosea will later be used to keep Arthur, John, and every lost soul in line while the world is changing faster than Dutch can accept. Dutch believes he is founding a family. Hosea believes he is tempering a visionary. Both are wrong. Because as their laughter fades and the plan for a gang takes shape, one question hangs in the smoke between them. When a man can talk anyone into anything, who will stop him when his dreams start to kill the people who love him most? From that question, the entire van der Linde philosophy begins to take shape. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, built on a creed that sounds noble enough to pass for truth, at least at the very beginning. Dutch's early creed is simple on the surface and intoxicating underneath. He preaches freedom from government and corporate control, railing against the railroads, the banks, the oil men, the politicians who sell the West piece by piece. The gang, he insists, will be a family in the truest sense, bound not by blood but by choice, stealing only from those more corrupt than themselves. They are not thieves. They are reclaiming what a rotten civilization has already stolen. In Dutch's mouth, this becomes poetry. Around campfires and in cheap saloons, he talks about a world where outlaws are the living embodiment of resistance, where no man bows to a badge or a ledger book. His speeches turn robberies into philosophy, violence into rhetoric. A train robbery is no longer a crime, it is a statement. A bank job is not greed, it is justice delivered at gunpoint. Who would not want to believe that? Hosea believes, but differently. If Dutch is the dreamer, Hosea is the accountant of risk. From its humble beginnings, he understands limits, how much heat the gang can take, when a town has been bled dry, when it is time to move on before the Pinkertons arrive. Hosea's philosophy is quieter, more cautious, built on knowing when to walk away. He shares Dutch's hatred of exploitation, yet he never forgets that the world is changing and the old ways are dying, with or without them. Together, they build a utopian experiment on the fringes of a rapidly industrializing America. Runaways, deserters, broken men and women drift into their orbit. Each new arrival is another lost soul, given a bedroll, a plate of stew, and a promise. Here, there is family. Here, there is freedom. Camp becomes more than a hideout. It is a traveling village, a story of misfits trying to carve out a life where civilization only comes with chains. Morally, they do not see themselves as villains. They are outlaws, yes, but outlaws with a cause, standing against a system built on sweat and blood while pretending to be respectable. Yet every stagecoach they hit, every lawman they gun down, deepens the contradiction. How different are they from the men they despise? Because beneath Dutch's ideals lies a quiet demand, absolute loyalty to his leadership. His freedom depends on everyone else obeying. His family depends on no one questioning the father. That is the seed of hypocrisy that will one day turn his philosophy into a weapon, aimed not at the rich or the powerful, but at Arthur Morgan himself. And once that seed takes root, every campfire speech becomes something more dangerous than simple inspiration. That danger begins with a boy who has nowhere else to go. Arthur Morgan's story is, in the truest sense, a story of abandonment long before it ever becomes a story of betrayal. From the very beginning, the world teaches him that protection is conditional, that care can be taken away. His father, Lyle Morgan, is a small-time outlaw who drags his son through a life of petty crime and constant movement, always one step ahead of the law and one step behind any real future. When Lyle is finally arrested and taken away in chains, there is no safety net, no concerned neighbors, no civilization eager to claim the orphan. There is just a boy left standing in the road, learning that the world was changing, and it has no place for someone like him. By his early teens, Arthur's already following the only script he knows. He steals, he fights, he drifts. He is angry at everything and loyal to nothing. In a different story, he might have ended up dead in a ditch or rotting in some county jail. Another nameless casualty of the old ways were dying. Instead, he crosses paths with Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews, two conmen who ride into his life looking for their next score and find a mirror of their own youth staring back at them. They do not meet him as a victim. They meet him as a threat. Arthur tries to rob them and discovers, with a bitter sort of irony, that they are in the middle of trying to rob him as well. In that tense, absurd standoff, Dutch and Hosea see more than a would-be thief. They see a recruit, a project, a lost soul who proves their philosophy can still reach the forgotten edges of the world. Dutch claims Arthur first with words: freedom, loyalty, purpose. Around the campfire, Dutch spins stories about resistance and dignity, about standing tall against a rigged system that crushes people like the Morgans. He teaches Arthur to read, to question, to see himself not as a stray dog but as the living embodiment of a grand idealistic cause. Hosea claims him with practice. He shows Arthur how to track game, how to case a town, how to read a mark's eyes and know when a lie is working. Dutch gives him dreams. Hosea gives him survival. Together, they do more than recruit him. They raise him. Arthur becomes Dutch's surrogate son, the proof that the gang is more than robbery, that its philosophy can take a broken boy and turn him into something better. Around camp, Dutch points to Arthur as evidence that their way works, that from its humble beginnings, this little family can reshape the lost and the discarded. That bond is deep. It is paternal. And it is exactly what will make Dutch's future choices feel less like strategy and more like a father turning his back on his own child. When the time comes, Arthur will not just question Dutch's plans, he will question his entire childhood. Because if Dutch abandons him, what does that say about everything that made Arthur who he is? For Arthur, the early years do not feel like a prelude to betrayal. They feel like salvation. Around crackling campfires and worn wooden tables, the van der Linde gang is not just a crew of outlaws. It is, in the truest sense, a family carved out of a hostile world that wants them dead or tamed. Those first camps are modest, from its humble beginnings in rough clearings to tucked-away riverbanks, but they carry an almost mythic warmth in Arthur's memory. There are small jobs that barely cover supplies, shared bottles passed around after a successful robbery, and evenings where Karen sings, Javier plays guitar, and Dutch holds court with grand speeches about freedom and civilization. The story, as Arthur sees it, is simple. Dutch saved him, Dutch taught him, Dutch gave him purpose. That kind of loyalty does not feel negotiable. Arthur's journal from this era is the living embodiment of that devotion. The early pages are thick with admiration, with sketches of Dutch standing tall against the horizon, with lines about how Dutch sees the world different, and how this gang is the only real family he has ever known. He writes about Hosea's jokes, John's stubborn streak, the way Susan Grimshaw keeps order, and he frames it all as part of a grand philosophy. Crime is not just crime, it is resistance, a story of the old ways refusing to bow as the world was changing. Yet even in those glowing entries, the first hairline fractures appear. Arthur notes moments when Dutch's temper flares too quickly at Bill, or when a simple plan turns needlessly bloody because Dutch pushes too hard. Hosea, ever the pragmatist, sometimes questions a scheme, wondering if the risk is worth the reward. Arthur records those doubts, then dismisses them on the next line as stress, bad luck, or the pressure of keeping so many people fed. How could Dutch be wrong when everything good in Arthur's life traces back to him? In this golden era, Arthur becomes Dutch's favored enforcer, the right hand that turns speeches into gunfire. He collects debts, breaks jaws, and rides into towns to rob banks and stagecoaches without hesitation. When Dutch says a man needs scaring, Arthur scares him. When Dutch says a man needs killing, Arthur pulls the trigger. In Arthur's mind, every violent order serves a higher purpose, protecting the gang's dreams of freedom from a civilization that would cage them. He does not see the pattern yet. Each unquestioned command, each line crossed in Dutch's name, is another brick in a road leading away from the idealistic dream and towards something darker. One day, Arthur will open that same journal and realize those early pages were not just memories of better times. They were the first quiet entries in the record of his own betrayal, and by then, the ink will be mixed with blood. By the time that ink is mixed with blood, another boy has already stepped into the shadow Arthur thought was his alone. Another stray, another project, another lost soul. Dutch believes he can shape into the living embodiment of his philosophy. John Marston's story begins before the gang, but it never really begins with choice. Orphaned young, passed between indifferent relatives and brutal institutions, he is beaten more than he is fed, punished more than he is taught. The world was changing, but for children like John, it only meant new walls, new rules, new hands to hurt them. He runs away barely a teenager, wanders the roads half-starved, and discovers that in this civilization, stealing is the only freedom that pays. From its humble beginnings, this is a story of desperation more than ambition. John does not dream of glory. He dreams of not freezing to death in a ditch. He robs, he fights, he survives. When Dutch and Hosea finally cross his path, they do not find a polished outlaw or a loyal acolyte. They find a feral kid with a gun and a chip on his shoulder, ready to rob the very men who are about to offer him a place at their fire. Dutch repeats the pattern from the very beginning. He offers John the same things he once offered Arthur: family, purpose, a banner to march under in a hostile world. He speaks of freedom and injustice, of rich men in fine suits and poor men in chains. To a boy who has only ever known cages, Dutch's words sound almost holy. Hosea tempers it with quiet realism, but Dutch is the one who dazzles. Once again, he is savior, teacher, father in the truest sense. Yet John is not Arthur. Where Arthur is eager to please, hungry for approval, John is skeptical, quick to test boundaries, slow to bow his head to anyone. Arthur internalizes Dutch's ideals, writes them into his journal as if they are scripture. John listens, nods, and then does what he wants. One son leans in, the other leans away. How long can that balance last? The early years are marked by friction. Arthur, the established favorite, sees John as an upstart, a reckless kid who has not earned Dutch's praise. John sees Arthur as a self-righteous enforcer, a man too willing to play lieutenant for another's dream. They argue, they compete. They trade blows and barbs on jobs that are supposed to be about unity. Yet in the fire of that rivalry, something more complicated forms: respect, then a rough brotherhood. The tragedy is that Dutch learns to exploit it. When John disappears for stretches, when his rebellious streak flares, Dutch turns to Arthur to keep him in line, to judge him, to help punish him. Each time Arthur obeys, each time he stands by while John is frozen out or humiliated, another quiet betrayal is written, not of Dutch, of himself. And one day, that will be one of the heaviest entries in Arthur Morgan's unwritten ledger. Because Dutch's shifting loyalties between these two sons will not just fracture the gang. They will decide who walks away, who is left behind, and whose blood finally seals the end of the van der Linde dream. That tension between Dutch's two sons does not explode all at once. It builds, quietly, stubbornly, in the space between two very different men trying to live under the same fading dream. From the very beginning, Arthur sees John through a harsh lens. John is the boy who goes missing on jobs, the young outlaw who disappears for months after Abigail has Jack, the man who questions Dutch's plans when everyone else is nodding along. To Arthur, raised on Dutch's philosophy of absolute loyalty, that looks like ingratitude. Dutch saved John, Dutch gave him a family, Dutch gave him freedom. How dare he talk back? John, though, is never quite as dazzled. Dutch's speeches about civilization and the corrupt world make sense to him, but he hears the gaps. He notices when Dutch claims they do not hurt innocents, then leaves bodies in the street. He sees how every failure somehow becomes someone else's fault. In the truest sense, John is less idealistic than Arthur. He believes in survival more than sermons. Early conflicts grow from that difference. When John vanishes before the Blackwater disaster and drifts on the edges of the gang, Arthur seethes. To him, this is betrayal in miniature, a man choosing his own pride over the family. When a job goes wrong and John questions Dutch's judgment, Arthur hears not caution but disrespect. Their arguments are not just about money or risk, they are about what it means to belong. Who gets to question the man who raised them? Who has earned that right? Dutch understands this fault line and presses on it. With Arthur, he is warm praise and quiet pride, calling him dependable, the living embodiment of the gang's code. With John, he is sharper, reminding him of past failures, of the time he ran off, of the son who did not quite measure up. One is held close, one kept slightly at arm's length, and both feel it. Is it any surprise that resentment starts to grow on both sides? Around the campfire, that dynamic plays out in small, cutting ways. Dutch sends Arthur on the most dangerous errands, trusting him to see them through, while John is sidelined or scolded. When a robbery sours and John voices concern, Dutch lets Arthur shut him down, then later tells Arthur he is the only one who truly understands. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, written in glances and half-finished conversations. All the while, the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the cost of Dutch's plans kept rising. John's skepticism hardens into quiet anger. Arthur's faith hardens into stubborn defense. Dutch stands between them, the architect of a family that is already cracking. One day, that balance will flip. Arthur will be the one doubting, John the one Dutch calls traitor. And when that happens, Arthur Morgan will have to decide which brother he truly stands beside. That balance does not crack in isolation. Around Arthur and John, the rest of the van der Linde family is forming, each new arrival bringing another wound, another dream, another potential betrayal. Javier Escuela comes first among the later recruits, a revolutionary in his own mind, a fugitive in reality, drifting north after failed causes in Mexico. Dutch speaks to him in the language of philosophy and freedom, turning outlaw raids into a continuation of Javier's lost war. Bill Williamson is the opposite, a discharged soldier drowning in humiliation and drink, the living embodiment of a man the new America has no use for. Dutch does not promise Bill ideals. He promises respect, a uniform of his own, a place where his temper and his gun finally matter. Charles Smith is quieter, harder to read, a man of mixed heritage who has never belonged anywhere. He is a story of erasure in human form. Dutch offers him a campfire, a chair, and a simple assurance. Here, no one will question his blood. Lenny Summers is barely grown, an educated young man whose father was murdered by racists, running from a civilization that preaches law while practicing terror. To him, Dutch sells revenge dressed up as justice, a chance to strike back at a world that has already tried to bury him. The women arrive with their own scars. Karen Jones, a con artist with a bottle in her hand and a laugh that hides how often she's been discarded. Mary Beth Gaskill, a shy pickpocket who dreams of being a writer, clinging to the idea that these crimes are just chapters before a better ending. Tilly Jackson, a former captive of another gang, rescued by the van der Lindes and determined never to be powerless again. Abigail Roberts, who has survived brothels, drifters, and John Marston's absence, wants something almost radical in this world: stability for her son. From its humble beginnings as three outlaws on the road, this camp becomes, in the truest sense, a found family. Dutch tailors his sermons to each listener: revolution for Javier, pride for Bill, belonging for Charles, righteous fury for Lenny, safety for the women, a future for Abigail and Jack. In return, they give him loyalty that feels deeper than blood, loyalty that seems unbreakable. Arthur stands at the center of it. He is protector, older brother, reluctant disciplinarian. He pulls Lenny away from the worst saloons, hauls Bill out of drunken rages, teaches Jack to fish and to draw while the gang plans robberies around them. When disputes flare, Arthur's word often ends them. When danger looms, he is the one who rides out first. Yet beneath the laughter and the shared meals, the world was changing. The old ways were dying. Railroads, telegraphs, Pinkertons, and new laws press in from every direction. Each misfit around that fire will soon face a private question: is this family worth dying for? Or is survival worth betraying it? Some will run. Some will look away. Some will actively turn on Arthur Morgan. And the tragedy is that most of them do not begin as villains at all. That is what will make what comes next hurt so much. Around the Van der Linde campfire, loyalty feels eternal. But the daily rhythm that holds this family together is also the pattern that slowly tears it apart. The story of their moving kingdom is a story of setting up, striking gold, and then vanishing before dawn, over and over, until the ground itself seems to give way. From its humble beginnings, gang life follows a simple cadence: find a hideout, pitch the tents, send the scouts, plan the next score. Days are spent hunting, mending clothes, sharpening guns. Nights are for Dutch's speeches about freedom and civilization, for Hosea's quiet jokes, for Arthur's silent sketches. Then comes the heist, the rush, the brief illusion of security. And as soon as the law, the O'Driscolls, or the Pinkertons get too close, everything is torn down, loaded onto wagons, and the caravan rolls onward, chasing the next safe horizon. At Blackwater, that rhythm breaks. The gang is flush, living near a growing town with a bank, a ferry, and a sense that the world is finally bending in their favor. Dutch talks of one last big score that will let them disappear to Tahiti, or somewhere beyond the reach of civilization. Arthur believes him. Why wouldn't he? Dutch's philosophy has always been that the world was changing, but that smart outlaws could stay one step ahead. Then the ferry robbery goes wrong, men die, and the gang flees north into the blizzard, leaving money, bodies, and certainty behind. Coulter is the hangover from that disaster, frozen in place. The camp is no longer the living embodiment of freedom, but a refuge of shivering horses and half-starved outlaws clinging to Dutch's promises. The move to Horseshoe Overlook seems, at first, to be a thaw. The grass is green, the town of Valentine is near, and Dutch insists this is a fresh start. Arthur wants to believe that each new camp is a reset, that past mistakes can be buried beneath new plans and new fires, but each move tells a different story. Clemens Point, with its Spanish moss and southern charm, hides the gang's deepening entanglement with the Braithwaites and Grays, a feud that ends with Sean dead and Jack kidnapped. Shady Bell is worse, a ruined plantation crawling with sickness and rats, where Dutch's idealistic speeches sound hollower against cracked walls and swamp fog. The old ways were dying, and the gang's world shrinks with every relocation, from proud hideouts to decaying shelters. Arthur begins to see the pattern. They are not moving toward anything. They are running from everything. Each new camp is not a rebirth, but another layer of denial, another attempt to outrun consequences that travel faster than wagons, on railroads and telegraph lines, in the notebooks of Pinkerton detectives who never forget. And at the center of all this motion lies one fixed point: Blackwater. That botched ferry job becomes an invisible wound, festering in every argument, every shortage of money, every half-truth Dutch tells. Who planned it? Who lied about what went wrong? Who is still lying? Long before Arthur learns the answers, that unseen betrayal has already begun to poison everything he trusts. The gang keeps moving, but the ghosts of that ferry are always one camp behind. Soon, they will catch up. Blackwater is never truly seen. It is felt. The story that begins on a frozen mountain is already a story of failure, of betrayal without a clear betrayer, of a family running from something none of them can quite name out loud. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had survived by believing Dutch always had a plan. Blackwater is where that belief is first wounded. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and the others go in after a ferry loaded with government money, a score meant to buy their freedom from the encroaching grip of civilization. Instead, the job becomes a massacre. Civilians die, gang members fall, the money vanishes into the chaos, and the survivors flee north into the blizzard, abandoning bodies and dreams on the docks. Details are scattered in fragments. It was supposed to be quick, clean, and theatrical in the way Dutch loved, a bold robbery that proved his philosophy still worked in a world that was changing. Instead, the Pinkertons are ready, the law is heavy, and almost no one agrees on who fired first. That confusion is not just logistical. It is the very beginning of doubt. On the ride to Coulter, Dutch offers explanations but never a full accounting. He blames the law, bad luck, the cruelty of the world. He insists the money is still there, that one day they will go back. What he does not do is sit the gang down and tell them exactly what went wrong. For Arthur, who has built his life on Dutch's certainty, that silence is louder than any gunshot. If Dutch's memory is so sharp, why is it suddenly so hazy here? Hosea feels it too. The living embodiment of Dutch's conscience watches his oldest friend talk in circles, chasing grand speeches instead of hard truths. In camp, Hosea's concern is visible in every weary glance, every quiet argument by the fire. Abigail is less quiet. She snaps at Dutch, questions the wisdom of dragging John, Jack, and the rest into a bloodbath for money that never even made it back to camp. Her anger makes something plain. Some in this family are no longer sure the risks match the rewards. No single trader is ever confirmed in Blackwater. There is no neat confession, no clear smoking gun. Yet the secrecy, the half answers, and the subtle shifting of blame create their own kind of betrayal, in the truest sense. Trust is broken not by one informer, but by the refusal to be honest. The lost money becomes a ghost. Dutch keeps promising to return for it, using that invisible fortune to justify new schemes, new dangers, new bodies. Each camp, each heist, he dangles Blackwater as proof that the next score will fix everything. Those promises will pull Arthur step by step toward his doom. And as the gang chases that phantom payday, something else begins to chase them. The realization that Dutch's word might no longer be enough. That realization hits first in the snow. Coulter is the gang stripped bare. No grand speeches around a warm fire. No easy scores. No sense that this is still a story of romantic outlaws dancing just ahead of civilization. It is wind knifing through threadbare coats. Horses collapsing in drifts. Children crying in frozen tents while the adults pretend this is only a temporary setback. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had survived lean times before. This is different. Blackwater hangs over them like a curse. They are freezing, starving, traumatized, and completely cut off from the world. Every can of beans is counted, every bullet matters, and every decision flows through one man. Dutch is not just the leader here. He is, in the truest sense, the difference between life and death. That dependence should have brought out his best instincts, the protective father, the living embodiment of the philosophy he preached. Instead, the storm exposes the first cracks. Dutch sends Arthur and Micah out into a blizzard that could kill them in minutes. On paper, it is necessity. They need food, they need information, they need hope. But watch the choices. Micah, the newest recruit, the man no one really knows, is elevated immediately, riding at Dutch's side, praised for his aggression. Arthur, loyal to a fault, shoulders the risk without complaint, even as the wind howls and the horses stagger. Does Dutch hesitate? He does not. When the trail leads to an O'Driscoll camp, Dutch's priorities snap into focus. Survival becomes secondary to vengeance. The gang is half frozen, the women and children are barely hanging on, and the old ways were dying out there in the dark. Dutch could avoid a fight, scout, negotiate, even withdraw. Instead, he leans into blood. Colum O'Driscoll is near, and that name drags Dutch back to a different era, to Annabelle's death, to an older wound that never healed. Ego overrides pragmatism. Philosophy gives way to personal score settling. Arthur follows. He storms the cabin, he hauls supplies, he drags John off the mountain when most men would have left him for dead. His lungs burn, his hands bleed, yet his faith remains. Dutch must have a plan, something beyond surviving the next day. Arthur's journal later hints at doubt, but in that snow he still believes the man who raised him cannot be lost soul or liar. In the background, Hosea coughs by the fire and counsels caution. He urges Dutch to think, to bargain, to remember that freedom sometimes means knowing when not to pull the trigger. Dutch answers with theatrics, with promises, with that booming voice that once inspired the whole camp. The balance between them quietly shifts, almost imperceptibly, from partnership to performance. And riding through that storm with Arthur, wrapped in Dutch's praise and protected by his favor, is Micah Bell, already testing how far Dutch will bend. The sharpest knife in Arthur's back is in its sheath for now, but the first cut has already been made. Micah Bell does not drift into the story of the Van der Linde gang. He crashes into it. In the frozen misery of Coulter, when morale is low and Dutch's authority feels shaken for the first time, Dutch brings in a new gunman and defends him instantly, loudly, almost aggressively. From the very beginning, Micah is wrong for this family. He is loud where the camp is weary, crude where others are cautious, bragging about killings and jailings as if they are trophies rather than scars. Arthur takes one look at him and feels that instinctive recoil, the sense that this is not a lost soul in need of guidance, but a man who enjoys the chaos Dutch only talks about. Dutch brushes that discomfort aside, insisting Micah is useful, insisting the gang needs men willing to do what must be done. Micah's usefulness is real, and that is what makes him dangerous. He is ruthless in a way that strips even Dutch's philosophy of its pretensions. In Strawberry, he turns a simple jailbreak into a massacre, gunning down lawmen and civilians in a frenzy that horrifies Arthur. What is a story of rebellion against civilization worth when it becomes simple slaughter in the street? Yet Dutch, cornered and humiliated after Blackwater, sees in Micah's violence not a warning, but an answer. Where Hosea counsels patience, Micah demands immediacy. Hosea wants to scout, to plan, to think 3 moves ahead. Micah wants the trolley station now, the bank job now, the blood and noise now. It becomes a binary contrast at the heart of the gang: restraint versus explosion, long-term survival versus short-term glory. And slowly, Dutch starts listening less to the old partner who helped build this world from its humble beginnings, and more to the new man who promises quick salvation through bigger, riskier scores. Micah flatters Dutch as he does it. He calls him the man with the plan, praises every half-formed idea as genius, feeds Dutch's ego at the exact moment the world was changing and the old ways were dying. Arthur questions, Hosea hesitates, even John pulls away. Micah never doubts, or pretends not to. In the truest sense, he becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses, given a voice, a gun, and constant encouragement. Beneath that loyalty, something colder moves. Micah's sudden ascent after Strawberry, his uncanny timing with Pinkerton ambushes, and Milton's later revelation all point to a deeper betrayal. Micah has been talking, feeding the enemy information while sitting at Dutch's right hand. How many of Dutch's bad turns are really accidents, and how many are guided nudges from a man who profits from every disaster? As the gang rides south toward Rhodes and St. Denis, Micah's shadow stretches longer over every decision, every argument, every betrayal still to come. The question is no longer whether he will turn on Arthur and Dutch's ideals, but how many will fall before the knife finally comes out. As the gang drifts south to Horseshoe Overlook and then to Clemens Point, the shadow that matters most is not Micah's or even the Pinkertons. It is the shadow inside Dutch's own mind, where 2 voices begin to argue over what the gang is supposed to be. A story of loyalty and betrayal becomes, in the truest sense, a story of influence. On one side is Hosea, the partner from the very beginning, the man who helped Dutch build this wandering family from its humble beginnings as a pair of con men. At Horseshoe Overlook, Hosea urges caution and negotiation. He talks of small scores, of laying low after Blackwater, of using guile instead of gunfire. When the gang schemes around Rhodes, Hosea wants to play the Grays and Braithwaites against each other, to walk away rich without drowning the town in blood. Dutch listens, nods, even smiles, but his eyes are already drifting elsewhere. Because on the other side stands Micah Bell, the living embodiment of every reckless impulse Dutch has spent years dressing up as philosophy. Where Hosea advises a quiet swindle, Micah whispers about bold robberies and public revenge. Hosea suggests a careful stagecoach job. Micah pushes the bank in Valentine. Hosea wants to avoid provoking the law. Micah is eager to shoot his way out of Strawberry and leave a trail of bodies behind. Each time, Dutch edges a little closer to the fire. At Clemens Point, this tension hardens into a pattern. Hosea argues for diplomacy with the local powers, trying to use Rhodes's decaying aristocracy against itself. Micah mocks the entire plan as weak and cowardly, pushing Dutch toward louder, riskier shows of strength. Dutch begins repeating Micah's words back to the camp, talking about needing one big score and refusing to back down when things go wrong. The old ways were dying, and Dutch, terrified of becoming small and irrelevant, gravitates toward the man who promises glory instead of survival. Arthur stands exactly in the middle of this quiet war. His respect, his sense of what is right, still leans toward Hosea's measured wisdom, yet his heart, his deepest loyalty, is chained to Dutch. When Micah goads Dutch into violence, Arthur often hesitates, questions, even protests, but he rarely breaks ranks completely. How does a lost soul raised to follow a leader suddenly declare that leader wrong? Hosea feels the shift long before anyone admits it. In campfire conversations and in Arthur's journal, there are hints that Dutch's ideals are slipping, that the man who once robbed railroads to strike at civilization is now chasing chaos for its own sake. Hosea speaks of getting older, of being tired, of doubting whether Dutch still believes his own speeches. The most important battle in this era is not a gunfight in Rhodes or a robbery in Valentine. It happens when the camp is asleep, when the fire burns low, and Dutch chooses again and again which voice to hear in the dark. Those quiet battles around the campfire are happening while a much larger war closes in from beyond the tree line. The von der Linde gang is not just fighting its own doubts. It is fighting time itself, as the world was changing faster than any of them can outrun. Rails carve across the plains where bison once roamed undisturbed. Telegraph lines stitch together distant cities, carrying news and warrants faster than any horse. Smoke from industrial chimneys hangs over places Dutch still calls civilization with a sneer, even as those cities grow richer and more organized. The old ways were dying, and the gang's story of freedom on the margins is beginning to look less like a future and more like an echo. Law enforcement changes with it. No more half-drunk sheriffs paid to look the other way. No more county pauses that lose interest once the trail goes cold. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency arrives as the living embodiment of this new order. Professional, methodical, patient. To them, the gang is not a legend to be feared, but a problem to be solved. Agent Andrew Milton and his quieter partner, Edgar Ross, become the faces of that new era. Milton is blunt, brutal, convinced that civilization must be hammered into the frontier by any means necessary. Ross watches, listens, already planning for a world beyond Dutch and Arthur, where men like John Marston can be turned into tools of the state. From the very beginning of 1899, Milton is not afraid of the van der Linde gang. He is already writing their ending. Each encounter drives that point home. At Coulter, Milton tracks them into the blizzard. At Horseshoe Overlook and Clemens Point, he always seems one step behind, tightening the net. By the time Strawberry and the jailbreak with Micah roll around, Milton has informants, dossiers, and an understanding that this gang is not a glorious rebellion. It is a dying animal lashing out. Dutch refuses to see it that way. For him, every Pinkerton raid, every new stretch of railroad, every telegraph pole is proof that his philosophy has always been right. Civilization is a cage, the government a tyrant, and the gang, in the truest sense, a story of resistance. Instead of adapting, he doubles down, turning setbacks into sermons. The plans grow grander, the targets bigger, the chances of survival smaller. Arthur stands in the middle of this storm. He still believes in the gang as family, still feels the pull of loyalty to the man who raised him from its humble beginnings. Yet each time Milton appears with more information, more leverage, more confidence, Arthur's journal fills with unease. How long can an outlaw dream last in a world that no longer has space for it? How long before Dutch's speeches become delusions? Because the more the railroads spread and the Pinkertons close in, the more desperate Dutch becomes to outrun history. And desperation has a cost. With every new scheme, he will ask more of Arthur, more risk, more blood, more blind faith, until those demands cross the line from leadership into something far darker and far closer to betrayal. Desperation has a cost, and in St. Denis, that cost finally steps onto the platform with a gun in its hand. The trolley station job is where Dutch's philosophy stops being an abstract story about freedom and becomes something far more concrete. The moment he chooses his own escape over the lives of his so-called sons. On paper, it is meant to be simple. A quick robbery at the trolley station, fast cash to keep the dream alive, one more score to outrun the noose closing around the van der Linde gang. In practice, it is chaos. The moment the gang moves, the law is already there. Bullets tear through the station, civilians scream and scatter, and the elegant city that promised civilization turns into a killing ground. The gang fights its way through the platforms and stairwells, trading shots with officers who seem to materialize from every doorway. The escape narrows, options vanish, and the old ways were dying in a hail of gunfire. In the panic, Arthur and John end up on the tracks beneath the station, pinned down, a train thundering toward them. It is a pure Western image, in the truest sense. Two outlaws on the rails, nowhere to run, the world itself bearing down on them. Above, Dutch has a choice. He can stay, risk everything to pull them clear, or he can flee. For years he has preached that this gang is family, that loyalty comes before profit, before safety, before civilization's rules. In this instant, those speeches are tested. He fails the test. Dutch looks down, sees Arthur and John trapped, hears the train, and turns away. He runs with the others, leaving the men he once called his boys to die on the tracks. The train roars past, missing them only because Arthur and John claw their own way out. Dutch's family-first creed is exposed as conditional. It holds until the bullets get too close. Back at camp, the betrayal is smoothed over with words. Dutch speaks of how bad it was, how there was no choice. how everyone did what had to be done. His tone is almost casual, a man discussing a failed investment rather than abandoning his surrogate sons. The living embodiment of loyalty now treats survival as an individual calculation, not a shared duty. Arthur is shaken. He knows, from the very beginning of that ride back, that something has cracked, yet he rationalizes it, telling himself Dutch could not have helped, that the world was changing, that their leader is still the man who raised him. This is denial as armor. Arthur's journal will later circle this moment, but in the campfire glow he swallows his doubts, because admitting the truth would mean admitting his entire life has been built on sand. The trolley station disaster is not an isolated lapse. It is a blueprint. Dutch will abandon Arthur at the St. Denis Bank, leave John and Sisika, walk away on that final mountain. Each time he insists it is for the good of the gang, that betrayal is somehow loyalty in disguise. And if he can leave Arthur and John on the tracks in a city station, what will he do when the whole gang is cornered, the Pinkertons are offering him a way out, and the only thing standing between Dutch and his fading dreams is the family he once swore to die for? Dutch's public betrayals happen in gunsmoke and shouting. Arthur's begin in ink and silence. From the very beginning, that worn leather journal is more than a travelogue. It is his private conscience, a place where an outlaw who has spent his life enforcing another man's philosophy can finally admit what he cannot say under Dutch's gaze. Around the fire, Arthur is the loyal enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's creed. On the page, he is something else, a man starting to wonder what that creed has really cost. The entry after Colum O'Driscoll's hanging is one of the first real fractures. Dutch parades the execution as justice, as the end of a feud that began from its humble beginnings in petty robberies and wounded pride. Yet Arthur's handwriting betrays a different mood. He sketches Colum's face, notes the fear and resignation, and questions whether this endless cycle of revenge has brought the gang any closer to freedom. Colum dies on a scaffold, but Arthur hints that something in Dutch's soul has been dying for years. Later, St. Denis shatters the illusion completely. The bank heist is supposed to be Dutch's masterpiece, a story of one last score that will carry the family away from civilization and into some imagined paradise. Instead, Hosea is executed, Lenny is gunned down on a rooftop, and the survivors crawl out of the city broken and hunted. In the journal, the bravado is gone. Arthur writes that Dutch don't seem the same, that the world was changing while Dutch clung to speeches about destiny. He counts the dead, and for the first time, the body count does not feel like the price of progress. It feels senseless. A pattern emerges on the page. Dutch promises safety, but leaves men behind. He speaks of family, but turns on John, Abigail, even Jack, dismissing their suffering as weakness. Arthur begins to separate Dutch's words from his actions, to notice that the man who once railed against cruelty now leaves innocence in the path of his plans. The journal becomes a ledger of contradictions, loyalty and betrayal, dreams and delusions, freedom and a tightening noose. Then the guilt sets in. Arthur does not paint himself as a victim. He admits that he helped make Dutch's threats real, that he rode down debtors for Strauss, intimidated Abigail when she begged for John, and stood by while Dutch's temper ruled the camp. In the truest sense, he sees that he has been the fist behind another man's failing philosophy. If Dutch is falling, Arthur has been pushing. Here the story slows. No gunfire, no Pinkertons, no grand speeches, just Arthur alone by lantern light, coughing into a handkerchief, sketching the faces of the dead and writing, simply, that something is wrong. The old ways were dying, and for the first time he wonders if they deserve to. The tragedy is not only that Dutch is changing, but that Arthur finally understands he may be part of the problem, and that understanding might have come too late to save anyone. Those quiet pages prepare the ground for what comes next. A man who has served a dream all his life, suddenly trying to live with his eyes open. Those quiet pages end in St. Denis, where reflection gives way to gunfire. The story of Arthur's awakening slams into the story of Dutch's final descent, and the dream that began as a promise of freedom and family meets the hard stone of civilization. From its humble beginnings, every campfire speech has been building to this night. Dutch swears that this bank job is the last big score, the one that buys them a ship, a new world, a clean slate far from the noose. He speaks of Tahiti, of mangoes and sunshine, as if geography alone can wash away blood. For men who have lost so much, it sounds in the truest sense like salvation. For Arthur, Already doubting, it is one more chance to believe that all the pain might still mean something. The plan is elegant on paper and doomed in practice. Dutch, Arthur, Lenny, and the others move through the marble halls of the Saint Denis Bank with the precision of professionals, masks on, guns steady, the living embodiment of the old ways that are supposed to be dying. But the world was changing, and unseen wires are already tightening around them. When Dutch forces the manager to open the vault, the real trap springs outside, not in. Hosea and Abigail are grabbed in the square. Agent Milton turns the gang's ideals into theater, parading Hosea before the crowd as proof that the age of the outlaw is over. Dutch hears his oldest friend's voice through the window, calm even in chains, still trying to steady the moment. Then the shot comes. Hosea is executed in the street, his body dropped like an example, his philosophy silenced in a single echoing crack. For Arthur, it is not just a comrade lost. It is the conscience of the gang torn away in front of him. The man who always urged caution, who questioned Dutch's wildest dreams and darkest impulses, is gone. In that instant, the balance that had held since the very beginning collapses. Dutch has no one left who can reach him. Dutch's response is not surrender, not grief, but fury. He refuses Milton's calls to give up, refuses to count the cost, insisting they can still fight their way out. Every dead civilian, every fallen gang member becomes proof in his mind that the world betrayed them, not that his plan has failed. When Lenny is cut down on the rooftop in a storm of bullets, Dutch barely hesitates. He pivots to blame traitors, informants, anyone but himself. Arthur sees it all. The bodies on the cobblestones, the smoke over the city, the man he once trusted dragging them deeper into a war they cannot win. St. Denis becomes, in the truest sense, the moment Dutch is unmoored. With Hosea gone and the gang shattered, Arthur is left with a choice that will define the rest of this story. Keep following the man who has already led them into hell, or finally turn against his own maker. When the smoke of St. Denis finally clears, the gang does not ride toward salvation or freedom. It is blown across the ocean, wrecked on the rocks of Guarma, exiled from the world it once thought it could outsmart. In the truest sense, Guarma is not just another chapter. It is a purgatory where Dutch's mask slips and never quite goes back on. From its humble beginnings as a band of idealistic outlaws, railing against civilization, the von der Linde gang now staggers ashore with nothing. No money, no horses, no familiar terrain, no Hosea to temper Dutch's worst impulses. The island is lush and beautiful, but for them it is a prison, a story of isolation and disorientation, of men who preached about freedom suddenly reduced to hired guns in someone else's war. Dutch, who once promised they would choose their own path, now has to beg and bargain with a foreign tyrant just to keep his people alive. Here, Dutch's paranoia stops being a subtle undercurrent and becomes the driving force. He aligns with Colonel Foussard's enemies, then treats the local rebels as expendable pieces on a board. He sends Arthur and the others into brutal assaults, watches men die for a cause that is not theirs, and talks about revenge against the world rather than responsibility for his own failures. Every setback is blamed on traitors, on the Pinkertons, on the changing world, never on Dutch. Arthur feels the shift first. He questions the wisdom of fighting another man's revolution, wonders aloud what this has to do with the gang's survival, their supposed family. Dutch brushes him off with grand speeches and quick temper, insisting that this is all part of the plan, that the money in the wrecked ship will fix everything. When Arthur presses, Dutch's eyes harden. The same curiosity he once encouraged now sounds to him like dissent. Moments that would once have been small disagreements begin to sting. Dutch snaps when Arthur worries about the rebels' lives. He dismisses John's importance when his fate is uncertain, muttering that John is gone and that they must move on. Pride replaces philosophy. Wounded ego replaces strategy. Dutch is no longer the living embodiment of a cause. He is a man desperate not to admit he was wrong. For Javier, Bill, and even some of the rebels, Dutch's ruthlessness still reads as strength. For Arthur, stranded on that island, it feels like a quiet betrayal. A confirmation that the old ways were dying not just out in the world, but inside the man who once saved him from being a lost soul. If Dutch can sacrifice strangers this easily, how long before he sacrifices his own? When the survivors finally claw their way back to America, they do not return with renewed purpose. They return with a leader who has stared into exile and chosen delusion over accountability. Dutch steps onto familiar soil a changed man, and the man he is becoming has less and less room for questions, for doubt, for someone like Arthur Morgan. The next betrayal is already waiting at camp. Shady Bell should have been a fresh start. Instead, it feels like a haunted house the moment the gang moves in, a rotting southern manor drowning in humidity and ghosts, the elegant bones of old money collapsing under mildew, mud, and gunsmoke. The world was changing, and this place is proof that even grandeur can decay into a mausoleum. Dutch walks through those peeling hallways, a different man from the one who left for St. Denis. Guarma has stripped something out of him and replaced it with something harsher. He is more volatile, snapping at questions, less patient with caution, and far more willing to listen when Micah leans in with some ruthless suggestion than when Arthur offers a measured alternative. It is a story of leadership slipping, of loyalty fraying, of dreams giving way to delusions. Arthur feels the shift in the truest sense long before he fully understands it. At Shady Bell, he spends more time among the tired and the frightened than around Dutch's planning table. He comforts the women after Hosea and Lenny's deaths, checks on Jack as the boy wanders the halls of a house that whispers of other dead families, and tries to keep the younger members focused on work instead of fear. Dutch, meanwhile, disappears into rooms with Micah, doors half closed, voices low. What are they planning that the rest of the family is not allowed to hear? The betrayals here are small at first, quiet enough to ignore. Dutch hides details about the money, about conversations with Agent Milton, about what really happened on Guarma. He dismisses longtime members' concerns with a wave of the hand, mocking their doubts as weakness. When Arthur or Charles question the wisdom of another bloody scheme, Dutch does not argue the philosophy anymore. He simply sidelines them, turns to Micah, and nods. Then the gang is driven from Shady Bell, and whatever light remained goes with it. Beaver Hollow is no manor. It is a damp wound in the side of a hill, a cave choked by mist and shadow, hidden in the woods as if the gang itself is trying to vanish from civilization. From its humble beginnings around warm campfires and open skies, this outlaw family has crawled underground. Here the pattern changes. Instead of grand robberies or bold speeches, there is the oppressive feeling of people living on top of each other in the dark, listening. Listening to Dutch and Micah whisper at the back of the cave, listening to Bill and Javier grumble, listening for Pinkerton boots in the mud. Beaver Hollow becomes the living embodiment of their paranoia, a place where no one quite trusts their leader or each other. Arthur walks through that cramped hollow as both caretaker and outsider, a lost soul tending to a camp that no longer believes in its own philosophy of freedom. He protects Jack from the worst of the tension, checks on the sick, calms the arguments, and tries to remind them all of who they were at the very beginning. Dutch, meanwhile, retreats deeper into the cave and into himself, sharing less, suspecting more, and choosing Micah's poison over Arthur's hard-earned clarity. By the time the smoke from their fires stains the ceiling black, the next, open betrayals are no longer a question. They are an inevitability waiting in the dark. By Beaver Hollow, Micah has found his true weapon. Not his revolver, not his knife, but his whisper. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, he becomes the quiet storm in Dutch's ear, turning doubt into doctrine and paranoia into policy. The method is simple and devastating. Micah never attacks Arthur and John head-on in front of the whole camp. He waits until Dutch is away from the fire, pacing in the dark, staring at the cave walls as if they hold some secret map to freedom. Then Micah moves in, all low voice and false concern. He calls Arthur weak, says John has lost his nerve, frames their growing conscience as a disease that will kill the gang. To a man already convinced the world was changing and closing in, that argument sounds less like slander and more like prophecy. Again and again, Micah speaks not to Dutch's reason, but to his ego. He tells him only he truly sees the big picture, that only his philosophy can carry them through as the old ways were dying. Everyone else, too sentimental, too frightened, too attached to family and ordinary life. When Dutch hesitates after the failed bank job and Hosea's death, Micah is there to murmur that hesitation is mercy, and mercy is weakness. When Arthur questions another bloody plan, Micah praises Dutch for staying strong while others lose faith. Who wants to be the leader who went soft when civilization finally pushed back? The poison starts to show in Dutch's own words. At Beaver Hollow, when Arthur confronts him about the senseless cruelty in Colm O'Driscoll's hanging or the Tahiti fantasy that will never come, Dutch doesn't argue the facts. He attacks Arthur's heart. He says Arthur don't believe no more, accuses him of being soft, of wanting to run away and play family instead of fighting. Those phrases are Micah's, recycled and sharpened. The man who once told Arthur to think, to question, now dismisses questioning as treason. In the truest sense, That is where the betrayal cuts deepest. Dutch does not merely drift away from Arthur through time and trauma. He makes an active choice between two voices: the surrogate son who has bled for him since the very beginning, and the newcomer whose main credential is flattery. From its humble beginnings, this gang was built on shared risk and shared belief. At Beaver Hollow, Dutch trades decades of earned loyalty for the comfort of being told he is still the living embodiment of his own legend. And while Dutch is turning, Micah is already gone. Long before those cave-side whispers, he has been feeding Agent Milton information, from Strawberry to St. Denis and beyond. So Arthur is not just being betrayed in campfire conversations. He is being sold in Pinkerton briefings. One man, two betrayals, closing in from both sides. The next time the gun smoke rises, that quiet treachery will finally explode into the open. From that moment in Strawberry, the story stops being just a tale of bad luck and becomes a story of calculated betrayal. The bars on Micah's cell are barely cold when Agent Milton appears, already armed with details no outsider should have. At the Strawberry jailbreak, Milton does not speak in guesses. He knows about Blackwater, about the ferry, about the gang's pattern of fleeing into the wilderness and reforming camps on the edge of civilization. He arrives too quickly, presses too precisely, and treats Micah less as a captured outlaw and more as a man already negotiating. From its humble beginnings, this confrontation is the quiet handshake that condemns Arthur Morgan. The world was changing, and Milton understood that an informant was worth more than a firing squad. Once Micah starts talking, the whole game board shifts. Law ambushes that once felt random begin to read as scheduled appointments. The Pinkertons hitting the gang on the riverboat job, the way they close in on Clemens Point, the sudden appearance of agents during the St. Denis bank heist all carry the same bitter question: who told them? In the truest sense, the answer is standing right beside Dutch, smoking a cigarette, pretending to be surprised as the bullets start flying. Micah's information does not just hurt the gang in the abstract. It narrows Arthur's future with every whispered detail. Each camp location passed to Milton shortens the distance between Arthur and his grave. Each job that goes bad for no clear reason is another step toward that final mountainside. Tuberculosis may be the disease that kills Arthur's body, but Micah is the infection rotting the gang from within, turning every dream of freedom into a death sentence wrapped in Dutch's rhetoric. The irony is almost cruel. Dutch, the man who rants about rats and traitors, who swears that loyalty is the only currency that matters, is pouring his plans, his fears, his philosophy into the ear of the very man selling him out. Around the campfire at Shady Bell or Beaver Hollow, Dutch warns everyone about civilization closing in, about the noose tightening, while the living embodiment of that noose leans against a tree and grins. Dutch suspects Molly, he doubts Arthur, he lashes out at Hosea's memory, but Micah remains untouchable. By the time Arthur's suspicions finally harden into certainty, it is already too late. The Pinkertons are not hunting at random. They are following a map drawn by Micah's tongue. Dutch is too far gone into paranoia and grand delusions to listen, too invested in his new golden boy to admit the truth. So when the final betrayal comes into the open, guns drawn and accusations flying, the question is no longer who sold Arthur out. It is whether anyone will still be alive to hear the answer. So when Micah's treachery finally comes into the open, it lands in a camp already primed to believe the worst. Paranoia is the new philosophy. Loyalty is no longer trust freely given, but proof demanded at gunpoint. In that poisoned world, Molly O'Shea does not need to betray Dutch to die as a traitor. She only needs to say she did. The scene begins in the mud and misery of St. Denis's aftermath, when the gang has staggered to Shady Bell and then to Beaver Hollow, dragging the ghosts of Hosea and Lenny behind them. Dutch is colder now, more distant, wrapped in grand speeches about freedom and civilization while the old ways were dying around his campfire. Molly, once the glamorous center of his attention, has been pushed to the edges, left to drink and watch as Micah quietly takes her place at his side. One evening, she snaps. She stumbles into camp, drunk and furious, interrupting Dutch in front of the whole gang. Her words are slurred, but the accusation is clear. He ignored her, cast her aside, treated her as ornament rather than family. In a world built on Dutch's rhetoric about loyalty and love, she throws that rhetoric back in his face. Then she delivers the line that seals her fate. She claims she told the Pinkertons everything, that she betrayed him out of jealousy and neglect. Is it a confession, or a desperate attempt to hurt the man who hurt her first? Dutch's reaction is telling. There is no rush to question her, no demand for details, no frantic attempt to understand what might have been leaked. He does not grieve. He does not even truly rage. Instead, he withdraws behind a mask of icy contempt. declaring that Molly is dead to him before Susan Grimshaw quite literally makes it true. Grimshaw, the living embodiment of camp discipline from its humble beginnings, steps forward, pistol drawn, and executes Molly on the spot. No trial, no investigation. Just a body in the dirt and a silence that hangs over the gang. Then comes the pattern interrupt the story needs. Much later, in a quiet, almost offhand conversation, Agent Milton admits that Molly never talked. Her supposed betrayal was a drunken lie, a final, flailing attempt to matter. Her death was pointless, a story of paranoia made flesh, and Dutch had been willing to accept that lie because it suited his growing delusions. Molly does not die because she betrayed Dutch. She dies because she no longer fits the narrative of the great outlaw prophet holding his family together against a cruel world. In the truest sense, Dutch betrays his own idea of family that night, choosing suspicion over compassion, optics over truth. And through it all, Arthur watches. He barely speaks. He simply stands there, taking in the sight of a woman shot down not by Pinkertons, but by the people who claim to love her. Another quiet line crossed, another entry written in his mind, and later in his journal, as proof that something at the heart of Dutch's dream has rotted beyond repair. If Molly can be discarded this easily, who is truly safe when the next accusation comes? Because the accusations will keep coming. Because the accusations will keep coming. And when they do, they will not just fall on outsiders, lovers, or hangers-on. They will land on the men who once shared Arthur's fire, his laughter, and his faith in Dutch's dream. Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela are not passing acquaintances in this story. From its humble beginnings, they ride with Arthur through frozen nights at Coulter, long watches at Horseshoe Overlook, and the fragile calm of Clemens Point. They rob trains together, clear out O'Driscoll camps together, drag each other out of gunfights that should have been their graves. In the truest sense, these are comrades made by shared blood and shared risk, not just shared loot. In the early camps, the rhythm is familiar and almost comforting. Bill grumbles, drinks too much, but follows orders and jokes with Arthur by the fire. Javier sings in Spanish, tells tales of revolutions and lost causes, and backs Arthur's play in skirmishes without a second thought. Their loyalty seems simple, almost unshakable. A story of brothers in arms, of outlaws against civilization, of a found family holding together as the world was changing. But at Beaver Hollow, that easy camaraderie curdles. The old ways were dying, and with them went the luxury of doubt. Arthur's questions about Dutch's philosophy, once dismissed with a shrug or a weary smile, now draw sharp looks and sharper words. Bill, always insecure about his place in the gang, begins parroting Dutch and Micah, throwing Arthur's illness and negativity back in his face. Javier, who once admired Arthur's steadiness, starts treating his concerns as treason. The camp itself fractures along invisible lines. On one side, Arthur, John, Charles, and Sadie, quietly comparing notes, quietly realizing that Dutch's dreams have hardened into delusions. On the other, Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier, clustered around whispered plans and promises of one last score that will fix everything. Bill and Javier stand a little closer to Dutch's tent now, laugh a little louder at Micah's jabs, echo Dutch's accusations that someone is poisoning the gang from within. Fear does the rest. Both men can read the wind. Dutch still has the guns, the money, the mystique. Arthur has a cough, a conscience, and a target on his back. In a world where every ride might be the last, staying near power feels safer than standing near truth. Their betrayal is not a single dramatic turn, but a slow, almost practical drift toward whoever seems most likely to survive. That drift becomes undeniable in the Beaver Hollow standoff. When the Pinkertons close in and Dutch chooses flight over family, Bill and Javier do not hesitate. They fall in with Dutch and Micah, retreating into the woods while Arthur and John are left behind, pinned down on the rocks, effectively written off as dead men. Years of shared rides and shared gunfire are weighed against a few frantic seconds of decision. Loyalty loses. Yet these are not cartoon villains twirling mustaches in the dark. They are frightened men clinging to the only structure they have ever known, sacrificing friendship for the illusion of safety. Is that choice unforgivable, or is it a tragically human response to a collapsing world? The answer becomes even murkier when the gang's greatest traitor steps fully into the light, revealing that some betrayals are not slow drifts, but calculated from the very beginning. Not every betrayal of Arthur Morgan comes with a gun barrel or a shouted accusation. Some arrive on quiet mornings in the shape of empty wagons, cold fires, and familiar voices that simply are not there anymore. In a story of loyalty and abandonment, the loudest treasons are obvious. The soft ones cut just as deep, From its humble beginnings, the von der Linde gang relied on more than Dutch's speeches and Hosea's schemes. It needed routine. It needed someone to turn chaos into meals, bullets, and blankets. That was Pearson. The former Navy man, camp butcher, and quartermaster, often played for humor as he fussed over stew or complained about supplies, is the living embodiment of the gang's ordinary working heartbeat. Through Coulter's blizzards, Rhodes's false gentility, and the swamps of Lemoyne, Pearson is always there, grumbling, carving meat, and handing Arthur ammunition with a shrug. In the truest sense, he is part of the furniture of Arthur's world, a constant presence in the background of robberies, rescues, and Dutch's grand philosophy. Arthur hauls carcasses to him, listens to his stories of the Navy, and writes in his journal about the strange comfort of that routine. Pearson is not a gun hand, not a strategist, not a prophet. He is simply there, day after day, helping keep this outlaw family fed and armed, which is why his absence later feels so sharp. After the gang collapses, after Beaver Hollow burns in memory and the Pinkertons tighten their grip, Pearson makes a choice. He does not go down fighting. He does not chase Dutch's fading dreams into the mountains. He opens a general store in Rhodes, dresses neatly, and sells goods to the same civilization the gang once claimed to resist. He hangs a photograph of the old camp on his wall, a private relic, but he never seeks out Arthur or John, never risks his new comfort for the people he once called family. Is that survival, or is it a quiet betrayal? The pattern repeats in another form with Uncle. From the very beginning, Uncle is the camp's running joke. A lazy, aging drunk who sleeps by the wagon, dodges chores, and tells tall tales about his old injury. He mocks Dutch's seriousness, teases Arthur, and drifts around the fire as comic relief. Harmless, it seems. A man who takes more than he gives, but who at least keeps spirits from collapsing completely. Yet when the gang truly begins to fall apart, Uncle's limitations harden into failure. As Dutch spirals into paranoia and Micah whispers poison, Arthur scrambles to protect John, to move the women, to salvage some shred of loyalty from the ruins. In those moments, Uncle offers almost nothing. No plan, no courage, no stand. He follows when pushed, complains when frightened, and ultimately survives by staying just behind whoever seems strongest. When Arthur needs another pair of hands to hold the line, all he finds is an empty chair by the fire. Here the pattern interrupt is stark. After scenes of shootouts, betrayals in the rain, and bloody mountain paths, the camera of memory lingers instead on abandoned camp circles, wagons rutted into the mud, and the echo of songs that have stopped. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and men like Pearson and Uncle chose to let the tide carry them somewhere safe rather than stand beside a dying outlaw trying to do one last decent thing. These are not traitors in the way Micah is a traitor. They do not sell Arthur to the Pinkertons or put bullets in his back. Their betrayal is indirect, a failure of loyalty and courage when it matters most, leaving Arthur more isolated with every passing day. By the time his final ride begins, the greatest wound is not just who is trying to kill him, but who is no longer willing to stand at his side. By the time Arthur feels truly alone, another, quieter question hangs over the campfire smoke. Has he really been the one betrayed, or has he been betraying someone else from the very beginning? Because for years, long before tuberculosis, Pinkertons, and doomed last rides, Arthur helps enforce Dutch's treatment of John as unreliable, selfish, and unworthy. Dutch calls John a follower, a man who runs when things get hard, and Arthur repeats that judgment until it hardens into camp law. That judgment does not just wound John. It keeps Abigail and Jack chained to a man the gang refuses to trust, denying them the chance at a stable life, even as the world was changing and the old ways were dying around them. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang claims to be a family in the truest sense, but that family has favorites and scapegoats. When Abigail pleads for John to step up, to stop disappearing, Arthur often sides with Dutch's philosophy instead of her reality. He mocks John's absences, shrugs off Abigail's anger, and treats Jack as another mouth to feed rather than a child growing up in a collapsing outlaw camp. The betrayal is not a single decision. It is a pattern of indifference. There are moments that make this painfully clear. At Horseshoe Overlook in Clemens Point, Abigail corners Arthur, begging him to speak to John, to push him toward responsibility rather than another reckless job. Arthur brushes her off, more focused on Dutch's next grand plan, the next heist that will supposedly buy their freedom. When Jack is kidnapped in Rhodes, Arthur rides hard to bring the boy home. But even then, his fury is aimed at the Braithwaites, not at the gang culture that left a child unprotected in a feud he never chose. So when does that change? When does the enforcer of Dutch's hierarchy become the living embodiment of its failure? The turning point comes after Guarma, after St. Denis, after Hosea and Lenny fall, and Dutch begins to sound less idealistic leader and more cornered tyrant. Arthur's illness strips away his delusions, and with that clarity, he finally sees Abigail and Jack not as extensions of John, but as people Dutch has never truly protected. In the final act, his priorities reverse. He rescues Abigail from the Pinkertons at Beaver Hollow, defying Dutch's order to leave her and John behind. He arranges money for their escape, pushes John toward a new life on a ranch, and tells him, again and again, to get Abigail and Jack away from this doomed camp, this dying dream. Every act of heroism is also an admission of guilt. Arthur's trying to undo his own past betrayals, choosing the fragile hope of one family over the rotting corpse of another. But that choice has a cost. In saving John's family, Arthur commits, in Dutch's eyes, the ultimate betrayal. The surrogate son turns against the father, and on a cold mountain slope, that fracture will finally explode. Arthur's final betrayal does not arrive on a mountain with guns drawn. It slips in quietly, in a cramped tenement room, with a cough and a bad decision. His body turns against him at the exact moment his faith in Dutch begins to die, and the illness that kills him becomes, in the truest sense, a sentence passed on everything the gang ever claimed to be. The moment is almost mundane, a routine debt collection for Leopold Strauss, the bookkeeper who dresses exploitation up as civilization. Arthur corners Thomas Downs, a poor farmer already coughing blood, and, under Strauss's orders, beats a sick man who is only trying to keep his family fed. In that struggle, the infection passes. Arthur's obedience, his willingness to be the enforcer for the gang's philosophy of family and freedom, plants the seed of his slow death. From its humble beginnings as just another job, this is the day the clock starts ticking. The tuberculosis is more than a disease. It is the living embodiment of everything rotting inside the van der Linde dream. Arthur's lungs fail as Dutch's plans fail. His strength fades as Dutch's conviction curdles into paranoia. The story of his body is a story of the gang itself, once powerful, now wheezing, staggering, unable to outrun the world that was changing around it. The old ways were dying, and inside Arthur, something else was dying too. His ability to pretend Dutch was still the man who raised him. When the diagnosis comes, reactions around him expose the quiet betrayals that words had been hiding. Hosea is gone. John is distant, desperate to protect Abigail and Jack. Some, like Charles and Sadie, look at Arthur and see a man, not just an outlaw, and their concern is simple, human, unadorned by philosophy. Others barely register it, too consumed with the next scheme. Dutch hears the news, offers surface sympathy, then returns to grand speeches and Micah's poison in his ear. There is no real adjustment, no stepping back from danger, no plan to spare Arthur. For a man who preached loyalty as a sacred bond, that absence is chilling. Yet the same illness that betrays Arthur's body frees his mind. What can be threatened when death is certain? With every coughing fit, fear loosens its grip. He begins to see Dutch clearly, to reread the gang's history not as a noble crusade, but as a chain of rationalized betrayals. If the time left is short, how should it be spent? Propping up Dutch's delusions, or trying to save John's family from the wreckage? That question becomes his final compass. As his body collapses, his moral spine straightens. He chooses to betray Dutch in order to be loyal to something higher than the gang. To John, to an innocent child, to the possibility that at least one lost soul might escape this doomed story. And in that choice, Arthur's illness stops being just a punishment. It becomes his last brutal chance to decide who he wants to be before the end. Because the disease is not the only thing killing Arthur Morgan. The real question is who he is willing to let die with him, Dutch's dream or John's future, and whose betrayal will echo longest after he is gone. Arthur's body is failing, but the real infection has been in the gang for years. It does not come with a gunshot or a Pinkerton badge. It comes with a ledger, a pen, and a quiet man named Leopold Strauss. From the very beginning, Strauss is the gang's banker, the one who turns Dutch's roaming outlaw dream into a business. He keeps the accounts, manages the donations box, and most importantly, runs a network of predatory loans across the region. Poor farmers, sick laborers, desperate immigrants, they all sign their names for a little hope. In return, Strauss sends Arthur, the living embodiment of the gang's muscle, to make sure every cent is collected. These debt collections are presented as routine work, just another chore between robberies and train jobs. Yet each visit tells a smaller, quieter story of betrayal. A coughing farmer in a collapsing house, a widow clinging to the last of her freedom, a family already crushed by the world that was changing around them. Arthur intimidates, threatens, sometimes beats men who have nothing left, because Strauss tells him the gang needs the money and Dutch's philosophy must be funded. One of those visits becomes the turning point. In the mountains near Ansburg, Arthur rides out to collect from Thomas Downs, a man already spitting blood into a handkerchief. Downs is working himself to death for a debt he can never repay. When Arthur grabs him, shoves him into the mud, the man coughs straight into Arthur's face. It is a moment that feels small, almost pathetic, compared to the grand shootouts and jailbreaks. But that cough is the death warrant. Tuberculosis does not announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in. Arthur staggers, collapses in the street, and a doctor quietly explains that his lungs are failing and his time is measured in months. The disease comes from a man Arthur was ordered to terrorize for a few dollars on a ledger. In the truest sense, Strauss's quiet cruelty has reached out and poisoned him. As Arthur's illness worsens, his disgust with Strauss grows. Those journal entries that once tried to justify Dutch's dream begin to question the entire foundation. What is this family, if its survival depends on bleeding the weakest dry? How different is Strauss's paperwork from the bankers and rail barons Dutch claims to hate? The old ways were dying, but the gang's methods suddenly look less like rebellion and more like a cheaper version of the same civilization they condemn. The betrayal does not end with infection. It ends with a choice. Back at Beaver Hollow, when Arthur has finally accepted his fate, he turns on Strauss. There is no gun drawn, no showdown in the street. Instead, Arthur walks into camp and, with a calm, exhausted fury, orders Strauss to leave. Just leave. It is a pattern interrupt in a story of ambushes and massacres. A man exiled, not executed. Strauss tries to protest, to hide behind loyalty and years of service, but Arthur has seen enough. In driving him out, Arthur is not just punishing one man. He is rejecting an entire system of quiet, systemic cruelty that has defined his life. That small, almost anticlimactic scene becomes one of the most powerful moments in Arthur's arc. A dying outlaw, finally choosing a code that values mercy over profit, sends away the banker who signed his death warrant. And in that silence, the gang's dream loses one of its last illusions, setting the stage for the louder, bloodier betrayals still to come. From that quiet refusal to kill, the story pivots back to the man who once claimed to hate senseless cruelty. Dutch van der Linde, the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw philosophy, had always wrapped his violence in poetry. He promised family, preached freedom, and swore that loyalty would be repaid in the truest sense. But by the final months of the gang, every one of those words had been hollowed out. From the very beginning, Dutch framed the gang as more than criminals. They were a family, chosen rather than born, bound together against a hostile world and a civilization that had no place for them. Yet the man who called Arthur and John his sons is the same man who leaves them on the trolley tracks in St. Denis, who abandons them in the chaos of the bank job, who rides away on that final mountain instead of helping either one to safety. The rhetoric is family. The reality is convenience. Freedom is the second pillar of his philosophy. Dutch insists that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that their robberies are a desperate stand for independence against a rigged order. But freedom becomes an excuse for recklessness. He drags the gang into Guarma, into the St. Denis Bank, into Colm O'Driscoll's trap, not to protect them, but to prove he is still the visionary leader. When Arthur can barely breathe and John's family's hanging by a thread, Dutch's version of freedom means everyone else pays for his dreams and delusions. Then there is loyalty, the word he repeats almost as often as he repeats one last score. Dutch demands absolute faith, demands that doubts stay buried, demands that Hosea, Arthur, and the rest trust him even when the plans stop making sense. Yet he lets Hosea walk into that bank without a real escape route. He watches Molly be dragged out and shot on Susan Grimshaw's word, never lifting a finger to question whether she actually betrayed him. He turns his back on decades of shared history to trust Micah Bell, a man the gang barely knows, over Arthur, John, and even Sadie. Loyalty flows only one way now. The promise of that final job, the mythical last score that will fix everything, becomes the cruelest lie of all. Each last job only deepens the noose around their necks. Each speech about Tahiti or some distant paradise is a story of salvation that keeps the camp moving just one camp further, just one grave deeper. For Arthur, the betrayal is not just in the bodies left behind. It is the shattering realization that the man who taught him to think, to read, to see the world as unjust, may never have been the principled rebel he claimed to be. Dutch's language becomes a weapon, turning murder into necessity, abandonment into strategy, doubt into treason. And by the time Arthur finally confronts him about these contradictions, Dutch has already rewritten the story in his own head, where he is still the hero, and Arthur Morgan is the traitor tearing their family apart. To Dutch, Arthur becomes the traitor. But beneath that accusation lies a harsher truth. For most of his life, Arthur Morgan is the one doing the betraying. Not of Dutch, of everyone Dutch points at. From the very beginning, Arthur is the enforcer, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy made flesh in Gunsmoke. When Dutch talks about freedom from civilization, Arthur is the man who rides out to collect that debt, rob that train, silence that witness. He kills in the name of an idealistic dream, intimidates in the name of family, and robs in the name of a better world that never seems to arrive. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an outlaw raised to believe that violence can be moral if the speech before it sounds noble enough. When someone crosses the gang, Arthur's there to make an example. In Polite Society, Valentine style, he helps teach the town to fear the von der Linde name. In The First Shall Be Last, he rides hard to rescue Sean not just out of affection, but to keep Dutch's legend of invincibility intact. Every rescue is also a warning to others. Fall in line or be next. More quietly, Arthur is used to crush dissent from within. When Strauss sends him to squeeze debtors, Arthur does not just collect money, he enforces obedience. The most damning case is Thomas Downs. A sick, desperate man, already coughing blood, is beaten in the mud while Arthur demands payment for Dutch's grand plans. In the truest sense, that moment is a betrayal of everything Arthur dimly hopes the gang might be. It is also the moment that kills him, even if the tuberculosis will take time to bloom. Later, at Clemens Point and Shady Bell, Arthur helps Dutch isolate Hosea's doubts, mocks the idea of backing down, and rides into Rhodes and St. Denis as if the gang can still outgun the world. When he roughs up those who question the course, he betrays their right to safety and autonomy long before Dutch does it openly. He helps build the very machine that will grind them all down. The diagnosis changes everything. As Arthur's lungs fail, his vision clears. His journal fills with regret. He sees that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that he has been Dutch's fist in a fight already lost. The horror is not just that Dutch has become a tyrant. It is that Arthur has been the loyal instrument of that tyranny for years. So his late-game choices become betrayals of Dutch in order to stop betraying himself. He protects John and Abigail, urging them to run. He rides with Charles and Sadie to help the Wapiti, finally standing against the same civilization he once harmed on command, but without Dutch's ego at the center. He turns on Strauss, driving the loan shark from camp, rejecting the poison that infected his own soul. In the end, Arthur chooses to break the cycle. He accepts death on the mountain rather than return to Dutch's side, giving John the chance he never had. One man, raised in violence, finally refuses to obey. And that refusal will haunt every survivor of the von der Linde gang in the years to come. Arthur's final stand on the mountain is not where his loyalty first fractures. That story begins earlier, in the dust and smoke of a doomed people caught between Dutch's dreams and civilization's advance. The Wapiti are dragged into the gang's orbit when Dutch seizes on a new enemy, the United States government itself. The tribe has already been pushed from its lands, its horses stolen, its treaty ignored. Rains fall, weary and dignified, travels east to beg the very men who robbed his people for mercy. His son, Eagle Flies, burns with the kind of idealistic rage Dutch once claimed as his own. 2 generations standing between the old ways and a world that no longer has room for them. From the very beginning, Dutch sees opportunity. He promises aid, promises justice, promises that the gang will help the Wapiti resist the army and reclaim what was taken. In truth, he is looking for soldiers in his personal war, bodies to throw at the same government he blames for Blackwater, for Hosea, for the death of his philosophy. When he sends Arthur to steal the horses, to sabotage the oil fields, to provoke the army into open conflict, he is not defending the tribe. He is using them. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a family of outlaws dragging another community into their spiral. Each favor Dutch offers the Wapiti pulls them deeper into catastrophe, from raids on supply wagons to the disastrous assault on the oil refinery. Dutch stands back and talks about freedom. The Wapiti pay in blood. In the middle of this, Arthur begins to change. Tuberculosis has stripped away his illusions. The journal entries grow darker, quieter, more honest. He rides with rains fall to collect herbs, listens as the chief speaks about loss without hatred, about survival without vengeance. Rainsfall is the living embodiment of everything Dutch pretended to be: principled, reflective, unwilling to sacrifice his people for ego. Arthur's respect is not sudden, but it is profound. The more Arthur sees Dutch manipulate the Wapiti, the more horror creeps in. Is this what the gang has always done? From its humble beginnings, has Dutch simply moved from one desperate group to the next, preaching freedom while delivering ruin? When Dutch ignores Rainsfall's pleas and pushes eagle flies towards suicidal heroics, Arthur finally pushes back. Helping Rainsfall evacuate the tribe, trying to shield eagle flies from Dutch's influence, Arthur quietly disobeys orders. On paper, it is a betrayal of the gang. In the truest sense, it is loyalty to something higher. To the innocent, to the wounded, to a moral code that does not bend every time Dutch feels cornered. Then the pattern breaks. For a moment, the internal politics of the van der Linde camp fall away, replaced by the wider tragedy of a nation grinding the Wapiti under its heel. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur Morgan stands there, a lost soul caught between a crumbling outlaw family and a people being erased in front of him. And once he chooses them over Dutch, there is no going back. Once Arthur chooses the Wapiti over Dutch, the next fracture comes fast, brutal, and undeniable. It happens on a train in the rain, not in some grand showdown with civilization, but in a botched robbery where loyalty is measured in seconds and bullets. The mission begins as so many van der Linde schemes do, with Dutch talking about one last big score and the gang trying to believe him. The plan is simple on paper: stop the train, get the bonds, vanish into the night. But the world was changing. The old ways were dying, and the Pinkertons were learning their tricks. The ambush turns chaotic, the law closes in, and in the scramble along the cars, John Marston is thrown from the train and torn open by wolves and gunfire on the side of a frozen hill. Arthur sees John go down. He hears the shots, the shouts, the sudden silence behind them as the train barrels on. When the gang finally brings the locomotive under control, Arthur wants to go back. John is not just another gun. From its humble beginnings, this gang had been built around the idea that Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and later John were a family in the truest sense. To abandon one of them on a hillside feels unthinkable. Dutch makes it thinkable. He glances back into the dark, weighs the risk, and with chilling speed declares John dead or captured. The philosophy that once justified protecting the weak now justifies cutting losses. There is money on the train, Pinkertons nearby, and Dutch's pride on the line. Turning back for John becomes, in his words, a waste. In reality, it is a betrayal. Arthur's reaction is instant: anger, disbelief, and a dawning horror that the man he has followed since the very beginning is no longer the living embodiment of loyalty, but a leader willing to sacrifice his own. He argues, pushes, questions. How can Dutch write off the boy he once called son? How can a man who preaches family treat John as collateral damage the moment it becomes inconvenient? That night lodges in Arthur's chest like shrapnel. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, played out in a few terrible minutes on steel tracks. Later, when Arthur risks everything to pull John off Sisika, when he drags him through St. Denis and shields him in the chaos of Beaver Hollow, part of that drive is pure love. But part of it is guilt. Guilt for not throwing Dutch off that train and going back alone. Guilt for not proving, in that moment, that his own code meant more than Dutch's orders. And in Dutch's cold decision to leave John to die, the future is written. If Dutch can abandon the son who once mirrored his dreams of freedom, what will he do when Arthur finally stands against him on the mountain and forces a choice? The answer is coming, and Dutch has already shown it. From the moment Dutch leaves John on that mountain, the story of his betrayal stops being hypothetical. It becomes the living embodiment of a man choosing his pride over his family. And almost immediately, the world answers that choice in the harshest way possible. Agent Milton rides into Beaver Hollow not as a hunter stumbling on his prey, but as a man who already knows exactly where to dig the knife. He arrives with soldiers, with confidence, with the calm cruelty of civilization closing in on the last outlaw dreamers. He calls Dutch out by name, taunts the gang with the truth they refuse to face, and drops the word that turns every head in camp. There is a rat among them. Milton does not speak in riddles. He boasts that someone in Dutch's inner circle has been feeding him information since Strawberry, that every desperate move from its humble beginnings in Coulter to this filthy cave has been watched. Then he makes his offer. If Dutch cooperates, if he surrenders Arthur or gives up what Milton really wants, The government can make things easier. Less blood, less pain, a softer end to a doomed philosophy. Dutch responds exactly as the man from the very beginning would, with performance, with defiance. He laughs off the idea of a traitor, spits back speeches about freedom and government tyranny, and refuses to even entertain that his tight circle could be compromised. Unless, of course, the traitor's Arthur. Or John. The sons who challenge him. The voices who remind him of what he once claimed to be. This is the moment where Dutch could have turned. Milton's taunts about a rat are not just an insult. They are a mirror. Dutch could look to Micah, the man who always seems to know where the Pinkertons are not. He could question Strawberry, the mysterious jailbreak, the way Micah whispers poison in the dark and pushes every plan toward chaos. He could pause, doubt himself, and protect Arthur from the worst of what is coming. He does none of that. Instead, Dutch doubles down on the story that everyone else is betraying him. He stares at Arthur with cold suspicion, treats John as an ingrate, and clings to Micah as the one man who still believes. In the truest sense, he chooses delusion over truth, paranoia over loyalty, pride over the safety of the people who still love him. From here on, Dutch is not just failing Arthur by accident. He is actively choosing a path that leads straight to Arthur's grave. When Milton walks away from Beaver Hollow, he leaves more than a threat behind. He leaves Dutch with a choice, and Dutch, already sliding from idealist to tyrant, has made it. The old ways were dying, but Dutch will not let them go, so the world will take everything from him, one lost soul at a time. Milton's ultimatum does not just hang over Beaver Hollow, it seeps into every shadow of the cave. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch van der Linde had already chosen delusion over truth. All that remains is for Arthur to drag that truth out into the open, even if it destroys what is left of his family. Arthur and John ride back into Beaver Hollow not as returning soldiers, but as witnesses. They have seen Micah meeting with Milton, heard the agent all but confirm the betrayal, and they come bearing the one thing this outlaw camp fears more than Pinkertons or progress. Proof that the rot is inside the walls. From its humble beginnings, this gang claimed to be different. Now its greatest threat is a man sitting by Dutch's fire. The confrontation starts slowly. Voices first, then accusations, then the rising pitch of panic as Arthur calls Micah a rat and demands Dutch finally listen. Dutch, flanked by his new favorite, does what he has done since St. Denis. He doubts, he delays, he deflects. Micah twists every word, painting Arthur as the traitor, the lost soul who has turned on the very philosophy that raised him. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, replayed in front of the entire camp. Guns come out, lines appear. Not on a map, but in the set of shoulders and the way hands tighten around iron. Charles steps toward Arthur without hesitation, the living embodiment of quiet loyalty. Sadie follows, jaw clenched, already past the point of fearing Dutch's wrath. A few others drift in their direction, pulled more by trust in Arthur than by any lingering belief in Dutch's speeches about freedom. Across from them, Bill and Javier move to Dutch's side, almost on instinct. They have bled with Arthur for years, yet their eyes keep flicking to Dutch, searching his face for the man from the very beginning, the idealistic outlaw who promised a life beyond civilization's chains. How does someone admit that man is gone? How does a follower confess that the leader he worshipped is now the one leading him to the gallows? That is the quiet tragedy of this moment. Their loyalty is not just to Dutch, but to the story they have told themselves for decades. To admit Micah is the rat is to admit that Dutch has been wrong, that Hosea died for nothing, that Blackwater, Rhodes, and St. Denis were not bold stands against a corrupt world, but desperate gambles by a man losing his grip. Arthur feels it break, in the faces that do not move toward him, in Javier's refusal to meet his eyes, in Bill's muttered curses that sound more afraid than angry. These are men he has saved, shielded, forgiven, men he dragged out of gunfire and off the bottle. And now, when he needs them most, they stand behind Dutch and Micah, leaving Arthur to face the two men who will define his end with only a fraction of the gang at his back. The cave falls into a terrible stillness, broken only by the drip of water and the click of hammers being drawn. This is no longer a disagreement. It is open rebellion. Dutch on one side, Arthur on the other, both surrounded by the family they built and are about to destroy. Who will pull the trigger first? Who will run? Who will be left standing when this fragile, furious peace finally shatters? The fragile peace does not shatter with a speech. It shatters with gunfire. Pinkertons pour into Beaver Hollow, torches and rifles turning the gang's last refuge into a killing ground, and in an instant the argument over loyalty is drowned beneath the roar of a world closing in. Arthur and John do what they have always done. They run and they fight. They carve a path through the cave mouth and into the trees, bullets tearing bark and flesh, the air thick with smoke and shouted orders. This is a story of two outlaws trying to outrun civilization itself, stumbling through the dark as the last dream of freedom collapses behind them. But something is different now. From the very beginning of this escape, Arthur is not the unstoppable enforcer Dutch once relied on. He is coughing, hard and wet, blood staining his hand when he drags it from his mouth. He stumbles on roots he would once have glided over. His breath comes in ragged gasps, every sprint a reminder that the old ways were dying, even inside his own lungs. John sees it. The player sees it. The world sees it. Arthur waves him forward anyway. He shoves John ahead, covers him with failing strength, forces his body to do what it no longer wants to do. Each shot he fires is paid for with another piece of him he will not get back. Then, amid the chaos, comes the pattern interrupt. The gunfire fades to the edge of hearing. The trees thin. For a brief, suspended moment, there are only two men on a ridge, the sun low, the sky bleeding gold. Arthur looks at John, really looks at him, and the omnipresent noise of pursuit falls away. No speeches, no philosophy. Just a tired man saying goodbye with his eyes. Here, Arthur makes his final choice. He tells John to leave, to take Abigail and Jack, to build a different life far from Dutch, far from the gang, far from the comforting delusions that kept them all chained. It is an act of love in the truest sense, a rejection not only of Dutch's latest plan but of the entire hollow rhetoric that held this family together from its humble beginnings. Dutch once claimed John was the problem, the traitor, the one dragging them down. By forcing John to live, Arthur commits the deepest betrayal Dutch can imagine. He ensures that Dutch's chosen scapegoat survives, that the living embodiment of Dutch's failures will walk into the new century and carry the real story of what happened in those caves. Arthur does not choose Dutch. He does not choose the gang. He chooses one man, one woman, one child. In that moment, the grand outlaw project dies, and something quieter takes its place. The hope that one branch of this broken family might escape the fire. The cost of that hope will be paid on the mountain, under a cold, indifferent sky, with Micah Bell waiting to collect the debt. The debt comes due on the mountain. Arthur rides into that storm already dying. Tuberculosis has hollowed him out, exhaustion drags at every step, and the climb itself feels less like a path and more like a final judgment. This is not just another outlaw shootout. It is the end of a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a lost soul trying to do one last decent thing before the light goes out. Micah meets him there with the vicious eagerness of a vulture that has been circling for years. The initial clash is brutal and intimate, not the clean distance of rifles, but fists, knives, and boots grinding into snow and rock. Arthur swings slower than he once did, his lungs burning, his body failing, while Micah fights with cruel efficiency, every punch thrown with the confidence of a man who believes the world, and Dutch now belonged to him. As they struggle, Micah does not just attack Arthur's body, he attacks his history. He mocks the gang's collapse, sneering that the Grand van der Linde philosophy was always a sham, that the so-called family was nothing more than a convenient shield for greed. Then he twists the knife further, bragging about the information fed to Agent Milton, the whispers that turned Pinkerton pressure into a noose. From the very beginning of Strawberry, he had been the rot inside the walls, and on this mountain he revels in it. Gunfire erupts, the fight spilling from fists to revolvers, from close quarters hatred to desperate scrambles for cover among the rocks. Arthur is coughing blood between shots. Micah is laughing between them. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and here, on this narrow ridge, the last defenders of that doomed dream try to kill each other in the snow. Then Dutch arrives. He steps out of the mist with a gun in his hand and years of history in his eyes. This is the man who found Arthur from its humble beginnings, who promised freedom and family, who claimed to be the living embodiment of resistance to civilization. Now, he stands silent as his oldest son and his newest disciple claw at each other's throats. Which vision of himself will he choose? Which story will he decide was true in the truest sense? Arthur pleads, not for his own life, but for the truth. Micah spits lies and half-truths, trying to drag Dutch fully into his orbit. Dutch listens, stares, hesitates. His finger never quite commits on the trigger. His silence becomes the loudest betrayal of all. When he turns and walks away, whether Arthur's honor is high or low, the meaning is the same. Dutch refuses to save him, refuses to condemn Micah, refuses to be the man he claimed to be. In that single cowardly retreat, every earlier abandonment is crystallized. The philosophy, the family, the code, all revealed as smoke. Arthur's story ends on that mountain. But Dutch and Micah's does not, and the choice made in that thin air will echo down the years, all the way to the dust-choked borderlands of Red Dead Redemption. On that mountain, the gang's long collapse narrows into a single, merciless choice. Yet the tragedy of Arthur Morgan is that even here, at the very end, the path splits in two. One ending is dignified, the other brutal. Both are born from the same betrayal. In the high honor ending, Arthur finally lives the philosophy Dutch only preached. He turns away from the money, from the last desperate dream of freedom at the edge of civilization, and chooses John instead. The ride back through Beaver Hollow, the frantic scramble through the woods, the desperate stand on the cliffside as Pinkertons swarm below, these moments are the living embodiment of everything Arthur has learned. He buys John's escape with blood and time, holds the line so a younger outlaw can try to become a better man. When the dust settles, Arthur limps to that ridge not as Dutch's enforcer, but as John's guardian. He confronts Micah, not for the score, but for the soul of the gang. The knife fight is ugly, close, almost animal, a story of loyalty and betrayal, and of dreams and delusions finally colliding. Dutch arrives, gun drawn, history hanging between them. Yet even when Dutch refuses to shoot Micah, Arthur's high honor lets him see past the immediate wound. He looks at the sunrise, accepts that the world was changing and the old ways were dying, and dies in the truest sense at peace with what he has chosen to protect. The low honor ending strips that peace away. Here, Arthur does not drag himself toward the light. He crawls toward his gun. The fight with Micah ends with Arthur beaten, bleeding in the dirt, reaching for one last act of violence, one last assertion of control in a world that has taken everything. Micah does not hesitate. He executes Arthur without ceremony, without meaning, leaving his body alone on the mountain as the Pinkertons close in. No sunrise, no quiet reflection, only the cold echo of a wasted life. Yet beneath these differences, the core remains unchanged. In both endings, Dutch abandons Arthur. In one, he walks away in silence, stepping over years of shared history as if they were nothing. In the other, he leaves Arthur to die at Micah's hands, refusing to offer comfort, justice, or even a final word. From its humble beginnings, this was a story about chosen family. In that moment, the family simply turns its back. Here's the pattern interrupt. The mechanics do not matter. Honor meters, branching scenes, alternate camera angles, none of that changes the truth. Whether Arthur dies in serenity or in agony, he dies betrayed by the man he loved as a father, the man who once rescued a lost soul and then, at the end, refused to reach out his hand. What changes is not the betrayal itself, but how Arthur understands it. With high honor, his journal, his final choices, his protection of John all give him a framework to accept Dutch's fall. The philosophy is dead, the dream exposed as delusion, yet he can tell himself he tried to make things right. With low honor, that comfort is gone. There is no redemption, only the realization that every robbery, every corpse, every broken promise led to this unmarked grave. So the two deaths are not two stories, but two lenses on the same wound. One man, one mountain, one leader walking away. The world moves on, indifferent, as Dutch and Micah vanish into the haze. But the echo of that betrayal will not stay buried. It will return years later, in a colder, harsher desert, when another former Vanderlinde outlaw comes looking for answers and vengeance. In the snow's aftermath, the story does not end. It fractures. Arthur dies on that mountain, but Dutch and Micah do not. They ride off together, two men bound not by loyalty, but by shared denial and unfinished betrayal. From that moment, Dutch makes a choice that echoes louder than any gunshot. He disappears with the man who destroyed his family. The leader who once preached freedom and loyalty now tolerates, even shelters, the outlaw who sold his gang to civilization. It is not the dramatic, fiery break Arthur deserved. It is a slow, rotting silence. Dutch does not shoot Micah in the snow. He rides beside him. In the years that follow, Dutch becomes a rumor, a shadow in Mexico, a whisper in New Austin, the living embodiment of a story no one can quite prove. The world was changing. The old ways were dying, and Dutch responds not with speeches but with absence. No manifestos, no grand robberies, no new idealistic recruits around the campfire. Just a man slipping further into the cracks of a country that no longer has room for his philosophy. Micah, on the other hand, does not vanish. He thrives in the ruins. He gathers a new gang in the mountains, terrorizes towns, and keeps living the same pattern that doomed the Van der Linde outfit. Treachery dressed up as toughness, violence passed off as necessity. If Dutch was once a dreamer gone wrong, Micah is betrayal in the true sense, stripped of poetry. Two ghosts, one hiding from his conscience, the other hiding behind his gun. Through all this, one thing never happens. Dutch never clears Arthur's name. He never tells the world, or even a single lawman, that Arthur Morgan did not betray the gang, that the real informant rode away at his side. He never admits his own role in the collapse, never confesses that his paranoia, his delusions, and his refusal to see Micah for what he was killed more than any Pinkerton bullet. In silence, he betrays Arthur's memory as surely as he once betrayed Arthur's life. So why, years later, does Dutch finally walk into Micah's camp in the first Red Dead Redemption? Why does the man who rode away with a traitor put a bullet in him and hand John Marston the hidden money? Justice, revenge, or a last attempt to buy back a piece of his soul? The gesture is late, ambiguous, almost pathetic from its humble beginnings and grand speeches about freedom and family. Arthur is gone, but his shadow remains. It hangs over Dutch's final decision, over John's haunted search for answers, over a West being dragged into a colder civilization. And as Dutch steps back into John's life, that unfinished betrayal is about to ignite one last time, turning a dying outlaw world into a reckoning that no one can outrun. The cycle does not break with Arthur's last breath on that mountain. It bends, it twists, and then it lands on John Marston, the man who walks away because Arthur forced him to. John's new life on Beecher's Hope, with Abigail and Jack, is not just a fresh start. It is the living embodiment of Arthur's final demand that someone escape the wreckage Dutch created. From its humble beginnings as a dream of freedom and family, the gang had promised John a place in the world, yet the ranch is built on a different kind of promise. Arthur dragging John out of Beaver Hollow, pushing him toward the future, and staying behind to face the Pinkertons, Micah, and Dutch's betrayal. Every fence John hammers in, every field he plows, rests on the knowledge that another man died so that his son could read books instead of wanted posters. Peace becomes a burden. Every quiet morning is a reminder that Arthur never got one. That burden twists into guilt. John remembers the nights he vanished from camp, the years he failed Abigail and Jack, the way he hesitated to challenge Dutch when the philosophy turned from idealistic rebellion into paranoid cruelty. He survived Blackwater, he survived Guarma, he survived Beaver Hollow. Arthur did not. In the truest sense, John walks through Red Dead Redemption as a man haunted by a ghost no one else can see, asking silently, why him and not Arthur? So when the government drags John back into the outlaw world, those choices carry Arthur's fingerprints. Hunting down Bill in Fort Mercer, tracking Javier into Mexico, finally cornering Dutch in the mountains above Cochinay. Each step can be read as John trying to finish the story Arthur started when he turned on Dutch and Micah. Arthur begged him to be better, to protect his family, to walk away from Dutch's delusions. John's grim pilgrimage through the remnants of the gang is both revenge and penance, a story of loyalty and betrayal replayed across a harsher frontier. Yet the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. John's attempt to honor Arthur by cooperating with Edgar Ross and the Bureau is a cruel irony, trusting another authority that promises freedom in exchange for one last job. Dutch once claimed civilization was the real enemy. Ross proves it by surrounding Beecher's Hope and gunning John down in front of his own barn. Another man who believed he had allies. Another man crushed by a system that used him, then erased him. John's death becomes a tragic echo of Arthur's fate, a mirror held up to the very beginning of the gang's downfall. Arthur was betrayed by Dutch and Micah. John is betrayed by Ross and the government that claimed to own his future. The target changes, but the pattern remains. And in the end, it is Jack, standing over two graves, who inherits that unfinished legacy of blood, guilt, and broken dreams, setting the stage for one last reckoning with the myth of the West. So when the dust settles and the graves are filled, a harder question lingers beneath the gun smoke. Who truly betrayed Arthur Morgan? In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in blood and broken on the rocks of progress, guilt is not evenly shared. Some betrayals are loud and obvious. Others whisper in the background until it is far too late to answer them. At the top, in the most direct and undeniable sense, stands Micah Bell. From the very beginning of the gang's final year, he is the rot in the foundation, feeding information to Agent Milton as early as Strawberry, goading Dutch toward cruelty, pushing every plan toward chaos. He is the living embodiment of self-interest. No philosophy, no higher cause, just survival and profit. Micah's betrayal is active, deliberate, and bloody. It hastens the Pinkertons' noose, isolates Arthur, and quite literally shapes the mountain where Arthur dies. Yet Micah is almost too easy to condemn, because the deeper wound comes from Dutch. Dutch is not simply a man who turns on Arthur in one decisive moment. He is an ideological betrayer, abandoning the very code he taught Arthur to believe in. From its humble beginnings, the gang was framed as a family, fighting for freedom against a corrupt civilization. By St. Denis, that idealistic language has become a mask for paranoia and vanity. Dutch leaves Arthur and John on trolley tracks, sacrifices Hosea and Lenny to a doomed bank job, then walks away again on the mountain while Arthur bleeds. Every broken promise is another quiet knife. In the truest sense, Dutch betrays not only Arthur's trust, but Arthur's entire understanding of what their world meant. Beneath them stand the secondary betrayers, Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and the others who choose self-preservation over standing with Arthur when the camp finally fractures. At Beaver Hollow, when Arthur and John beg them to see what Dutch has become, Bill and Javier turn their guns on their old brother rather than risk Dutch's wrath. Is that loyalty, or fear dressed up as loyalty? Their choice does not pull the trigger on Arthur's life, but it abandons him to Micah's manipulation and Dutch's delusions. Then come the quiet abandoners, the ones whose betrayal looks almost ordinary. Pearson packing up the wagons, Uncle slinking away, camp followers dispersing into the wilderness. No Pinkertons, no shootouts, just people deciding that this lost soul of a gang is no longer worth saving. Their departure leaves Arthur walking into his final missions with a hollowed-out camp behind him, the illusion of family stripped bare. And finally, the most uncomfortable category of all, Arthur himself. Long before anyone sells him out, Arthur has betrayed John and Abigail by enabling Dutch's recklessness, mocked John's attempts to leave, and helped ruin countless strangers in the name of a philosophy he barely questioned. His last days are spent trying to pay that debt, dragging John toward a different future, giving away his money, choosing mercy where he once chose the gun. In that struggle, as the old ways were dying, Arthur's own search for redemption exposes every other betrayal for what it truly was, setting the stage for who carries his guilt forward next. Arthur's search for redemption does not happen in a vacuum. It unfolds against a continent rewriting its own story, where the dream Dutch preached is revealed as an echo of a much older promise that America itself never truly kept. From the very beginning, Dutch's philosophy dresses outlawry in the language of the frontier. He talks about freedom, self-determination, the right to live beyond the reach of a corrupt civilization. To the gang, that sounds new and radical. In truth, it is a story of the American West retold around a campfire. The frontier is an open canvas where anyone can reinvent themselves, escape their past, and carve out a future through will alone. Dutch simply swaps homesteaders for gunmen and calls it enlightenment, but the world was changing. The gang rides through rail lines under construction, oil derricks punching into the sky, Pinkerton agents acting as the long arm of distant capital. The wide open spaces Dutch romanticizes are already being surveyed, fenced, and bought. Every time the gang flees to a new camp, those moves mirror a historical reality. The last wild pockets of the West shrinking as corporations, railroads, and federal law erase the margins where outlaws once slipped through. The old ways were dying, and the von der Linde gang becomes the living embodiment of that death rattle. Betrayal is not just personal in this world, it is structural. The same nation that promised Native Americans treaties and protection now pushes them onto reservations, or uses men like the gang to do its dirty work. Workers lay track, dig mines, and build cities, only to be discarded the moment they protest. In that context, Arthur and his family of misfits are not unique. They are one more expendable tool in a machine that uses desperate people, then throws them away when they become inconvenient. Here the pattern interrupts. Step back from Dutch and Micah, from Arthur's journal and John's escape, and imagine the camera pulling wide. The gang's campfires become pinpricks against a vast landscape of broken deals and fading horizons. How much real choice did any of them have? When civilization arrives backed by rifles and ledgers, is loyalty anything more than a temporary illusion? Arthur emerges in this wider frame as a tragic hero in the truest sense. From its humble beginnings, his life is sold to him as a tale of freedom and family, a band of outlaws standing against a rigged world. Only near the end does he see that the ideals were compromised from the start, both inside the gang and in the country they crossed. Dutch borrows the language of resistance from a nation that already betrayed its own promises. Arthur dies, realizing he has been fighting for a dream built on older delusions, setting the stage for who will inherit that burden and who will repeat the same mistakes under a different flag. Arthur's realization does not echo through history. It dies on a mountaintop, in a world already turning its gaze to railroads, corporations, and the next story of progress. The world was changing, and the men who would be remembered were not the ones who tried to understand what that change meant, but the ones who survived long enough to be written about. In the official and unofficial histories of the West, Arthur Morgan becomes a shadow. Lawmen speak of Dutch van der Linde, the charismatic outlaw philosopher. Newspapers fixate on John Marston, the reformed gunman forced to hunt his old family. Pinkerton reports mention a large enforcer here and there, a nameless hand in robberies and jailbreaks, but the details blur. From its humble beginnings to its bloody end, the gang's legend condenses around Dutch's rhetoric and John's reluctant heroism, while Arthur's name fades into rumor, into campfire exaggeration, into nothing at all. Yet in the truest sense, his real legacy was never meant for history books. It lives in small, stubborn corners of the world. It lives at Beecher's Hope, in the quiet routines of John's ranch, where a former outlaw learns to fix fences instead of gunfights, because a dying man told him that was the only future worth chasing. It lives in Jack Marston, reading the kinds of books Arthur once tried to sound out, growing up with a chance at something beyond the cycle of revenge that killed his father's family. It lives with the Wapiti, who endure after the government and Cornwall try to erase them, helped in part by an outlaw who finally recognizes a betrayal larger than his own. It lingers with the people Arthur aids along the road, the widow he teaches to hunt, the veterans he listens to, the prisoners he frees. To the world, he is a criminal. To a scattered few, he is simply remembered as a good man who appeared, helped, and rode on. That tension between legend and memory is where the player enters the story of Arthur Morgan most directly. His journal, full of sketches, doubts, and bitter jokes, becomes a record no historian will read but the audience understands intimately. Every choice, whether to collect debts for Strauss or walk away, whether to help the desperate or ignore them, decides which version of Arthur exists when the final page is turned. Did he die as a thug clinging to Dutch's delusions, or as a man who tried too late to change? Arthur's life becomes proof that even in a world built on betrayal, individual acts of courage and compassion still matter, even when civilization refuses to notice. The old ways were dying, but that death did not erase the small mercies that made them bearable. A ranch that stands, a child who reads, a nation that survives one more winter. These are not the headlines of an era, yet they are the living embodiment of what Arthur fought for at the end. So the question lingers, when his story's over, which Arthur remains in memory, and which betrayal in his journey still cuts the deepest? In the end, the saga of Arthur Morgan's betrayals does not begin with a gunshot or a cough of blood on a mountainside. It begins with two men laughing in a saloon, each trying to rob the other, and realizing they have found in that mirrored deceit a partner for life. From its humble beginnings, the van der Linde gang is born not in hatred, but in shared charm, shared nerve, and a shared belief that the world is rigged against the poor. From the very beginning, Dutch and Hosea sell a philosophy as much as a plan. They gather a boy named Arthur, then later John, and promise them freedom, family, and a place outside the reach of civilization. The early years, the golden years, are almost convincing. Campfires at Horseshoe Overlook, laughter at Clemens Point, the illusion that robbing the rich can somehow cleanse an outlaw soul. Yet even then, Hosea's quiet doubts and Arthur's first uneasy journal entries whisper that the dream has cracks. Those cracks become canyons after Blackwater. Each new camp marks another step down, the cold desperation of Coulter, the decaying elegance of Shady Bell, the fevered paranoia of Beaver Hollow. Every heist meant to be the last big score only deepens the debt. Every promise of one more job pushes the gang further from the family it pretends to be. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch's answer is not to adapt, but to double down on a story of freedom that has already curdled into delusions. The central betrayal is not a single act, but a slow unmaking of a man. Dutch shifts from charismatic idealist into paranoid tyrant, abandoning Arthur at the trolley station, leaving him in the chaos of St. Denis, turning his back on him on that final mountain. Micah Bell simply sharpens the knife, whispering poison in Dutch's ear while feeding Agent Milton information as early as Strawberry. Around them, lesser betrayals accumulate. Molly dying for a lie Dutch only imagines, Bill and Javier standing with Dutch and Micah at Beaver Hollow, Pearson and others walking away when the center no longer holds. Yet the harshest truth is that Arthur's own loyalty paves the road to his ruin. For years he enforces Dutch's will, excuses the philosophy, writes in his journal to make sense of a life built on robbery and blood. Only when tuberculosis strips away his illusions does he see in the truest sense that the gang he bled for cannot bear the weight of his faith. He does not just die from disease. He dies from loving the wrong dream too long. So as the camps fade, the journal closes, and that final breath leaves his body, a question remains hanging over the mountains in the years that follow. Who truly killed Arthur Morgan? And whose betrayal still echoes loudest in this broken world? That question does not fade with him on that mountainside. It lingers, it festers, it follows every replay and every campfire conversation. Whose betrayal cut the deepest in the end? For some, the answer will always be Dutch. From its humble beginnings, this was a man presented as mentor, father, and prophet, the living embodiment of a philosophy that promised freedom from a corrupt civilization. Yet step by step, camp by camp, he abandons the very people who made that dream real. He leaves Arthur and John on those trolley tracks, walks away from Hosea's memory, turns his back on Arthur's outstretched hand in the snow. Was that slow, rotting abandonment the real murder weapon? Others will point to Micah Bell, because his betrayal is not slow. It is cold, calculated, and transactional. From the very beginning in Strawberry, he is already talking to Agent Milton, already selling out the gang for his own survival. He whispers in Dutch's ear at Beaver Hollow, poisons every doubt, and stands over Arthur at the end with a grin that has nothing to do with family and everything to do with victory. Did the gang fall because Dutch lost his way, or because Micah made sure he never found it again? Then there are the quieter fractures, the betrayals that come not with gunshots, but with absence. Bill and Javier choose Dutch and Micah, watching Arthur and John bleed in the mud. Pearson, who once fussed over stew and supplies, simply packs his wagon and walks into a safer world, leaving the man who hunted for his meat to die in the wilderness. These are not grand acts of treason, they are small human decisions to survive. Do those hurt more precisely because they are so ordinary? Yet there is another question beneath all of this. In the truest sense, did Arthur himself betray anyone long before they betrayed him? For years, he enforced Dutch's will, dragged John back to the gang, helped keep Abigail and Jack trapped in a life they were desperate to escape. Every time he shook down a debtor for Strauss, every time he rode out under Dutch's banner, some part of that family paid the price. When his honor shifts and he turns to save John's family, is that redemption or an apology that came too late? Every player carries a different version of Arthur's soul. High honor, low honor, somewhere in between, choosing to help John on that final ride, or hesitating, or going back for the money. Those choices shape how his last moments feel. Is he a lost soul finally seeing the world as it really is, or an outlaw crushed beneath dreams and delusions that were never his to begin with? So another debate waits in the dust. Did any member of that gang truly deserve his loyalty? Or was the only honest act left to him the decision to break away and protect John, Abigail, and Jack from the ruins of Dutch's empire? In a moment, the story will pull back and look at why this man, this death, and this broken family still call players back long after the credits roll. In a world where the old ways were dying, but his memory refuses to fade. The story does not end with the last shot on that mountain or the final credits fading to black. The story lingers, an echo in the hills and in the quiet pages of a worn leather journal, because Arthur Morgan embodies something far more complicated than a tragic outlaw death. From its humble beginnings, this was always a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in desperation and tested by time. Arthur stands at the center of it, not as a pure hero or a simple villain, but as a man dragged between who he was taught to be and who, in the truest sense, he wants to become. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he is caught in that tightening space between freedom and civilization, between Dutch's philosophy and the reality written in blood around him. That is why his betrayals cut so deeply. Dutch's slow collapse from idealistic mentor into paranoid tyrant mirrors a wound many know too well. The moment a trusted figure, a belief, or an ideal finally reveals its cracks. Friends drift apart, promises are broken, and causes that once felt noble begin to look hollow. How many have stayed too long in a failing job, a failing relationship, a failing family, because admitting the truth meant admitting years had been built on a lie? Arthur lives that realization in real time. Every journal entry, every coughing fit, every sidelong glance at Dutch and Micah at Beaver Hollow is another admission that the gang he defended is gone, even if the bodies are still sitting around the fire. Micah's treachery is obvious, but it is Dutch's refusal to see it. Bill and Javier's decision to look away, Pearson's quiet departure, and Molly's senseless death that form the heavier chain of betrayal. They do not just betray Arthur, they betray the very beginning of what the gang claimed to be. Yet Arthur's power as a character does not end with what is done to him. It rests in what he chooses to do with what time he has left. He cannot erase the farms robbed, the trains blown apart, the innocents caught in the crossfire, but he can ride back for John at the gun foundry. He can push Abigail to run. He can turn his gun away from Dutch's madness and toward a different kind of loyalty. Is that not, in the end, the only kind of redemption that means anything? Arthur Morgan becomes the living embodiment of a second chance that comes too late to save himself, but not too late to matter. In a world crowded with betrayals, he proves that changing course, even at the edge of the cliff, still has weight. That is why his story returns, why this entire lore of betrayal still holds such power, because it whispers that it is never truly too late to see clearly, to admit what is broken, and to choose a different road for those who can still be saved. For those who have followed this saga of the van der Linde gang from camp to camp, from snowstorm to swamp, there are still more stories buried in this world. The quiet strength of Charles, the burning grief of Sadie, the long shadow that Dutch and Micah cast over John's final years. Each thread reveals another angle on the same questions of loyalty, regret, and the cost of freedom. And so the final image returns to that mountain, Arthur on the ridge, the sun pushing through the clouds, the wind carrying away the sounds of gunfire and accusation. Not just a victim of betrayal, not just a lost soul abandoned by the man who raised him, but a man who, at the very end, decided who he wanted to be. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. Arthur Morgan chose for once not to run from that truth, but to face it as the light finally broke over the horizon.